That was another, there was a period when we said kinda, people were saying kinda,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
kinda like, yeah.
I'm listening a lot to 1940s radio shows on my radio streaming, and I listen to like audio noir, which is detective shows from the 30s and 40s. And whenever they said the word like, it was immediately followed by a simile or a metaphor of some kind. They never just used the word without following it with something. I don't know, like I woke up and my bed was like a contour map of the Sierra Madres. You know, it would always be something like that.
Well, Raymond Chandler's writings are like that. Dashiell Hammett, but Raymond Chandler.
Yeah. The one I heard this morning was the walls were dingy like stale peanut butter.
So you didn't bring your laptop.
Oh, was it? So good. Oh, I wanna listen to that. Audio noir. Is that what it's actually called? Audio noir?
Yeah, it's a streaming station that only plays 30s and 40s detective shows.
Oh wow.
So guys,
those are
almost ready.
Listening to that I've been listening a lot to Audible books.
Yeah.
And it makes up for not having known my grandparents and listening to stories. And so when I sample them, the voice is so important, and and basically the cadence and the intonation, and some of them are just so amazing now. One written by Neil Gaiman called American Gods, which is the analog gods are going to slug it out with the digital gods, which I think is a pretty great premise.
Yes.
And there's like 10 voice actors in this thing. So it's like watching a stage production, and it must have been written with the objective of it being voice with no image. Because when you listen to radio shows, it's so vivid.
Yeah.
And that's a great exercise, as you know, Greg, for working out your brain, basically working out the mind's eye, you know.
By the way, that story you're talking about, the gods fighting, Robert Heinlein wrote a book called Job, A Comedy of Justice. It's based on the biblical Job, but it's Heinlein, and it's about the gods having it out with each other. I think you might like it. And
that'd be good.
Have you seen that? They made a series out of it.
Out of Heinlein's book?
No, American Gods with Ian McShane, the guy from Deadwood. It's really good.
Oh, they did?
I haven't seen that.
It's on Stars, I think, but it's really well done. They did a good job.
Okay, guys, we're going to start.
Ready? All right, super.
All right. So those of you who've heard this introduction, you're going to hear it again. But let me introduce who's with us. Craig Dykers, you know, from this morning, and because we've met him physically. John Petronis, you probably do not know. John is a good and old friend. We write together, research together. He is a professor at Georgia Tech and a great expert on space syntax, but a great deal else about architecture. Corey, our very own Corey B, who could be in this room, but for some reason has chosen to be in another building. He said something about putting out fires. So I'm expecting to see fires behind you.
Turn off my video when I'm putting those out, but yeah.
Okay. Michael Rotondi, also a good friend, the inventor and director of SciArc. Still teaches there at SciArc. He and I stay very close communication. Nicole Wiedemann, professor of design and architecture here. Hi, Nicole. Me, and then the students. So we're going to start with me doing a quick introduction for those of you who need to be bored. Okay, here. So the semester started with 3 exercises, which were, here is Elizabeth Alfred. Hey, Elizabeth, come and sit next to Nicole and log in. The only reason to log in, by the way, so the whole face shows up.
Okay. Here you go.
We did 3 exercises. One which is about geometry, trying to see it as a dynamic system and not as a static system. But we stayed pretty much with no squares, the circles, and what have you. Kind of classical, kind of animated. But the idea was to bring up the idea of geometry. The second exercise was a still life, a 3D still life, in which they were to choose some fruit, make a still life with it, and illuminate it with color and light to bring out the best of the fruit. That obviously was a preview, or yeah, of the idea of displaying things to their best advantage. The third exercise was to do a portrait sculpture of someone close and gone, someone usually in their family. Not so much a memorial or a gravestone, but just some object that had the character of someone they loved that is no longer living. That is turn your sound down and we went on to doing the new name museum, which we're going to look at today. As part of the semester, the students visited Dallas, Fort Worth, and Houston, and visited these well-known museums there. We've had participation from these people. Now I'm going to show you the site. The University of Texas of Austin, which is where we are now, near the bottom, about 1 mile north is our site. It's in a residential neighborhood next to a park called Shot Park. And our site is this one. And as you can see, it's about 400 feet north to south and about 320 feet east to west. North is up here. That building on the bottom right of the site is the existing Elizabeth May Museum, which was really, it was called Formosa in her day, 1910s or so. It was basically her studio, was where she lived and worked. And now, of course, it's a museum. You can see there's a creek, Waller Creek, that runs through the site, west to east. It's prone to flooding. It's not very well kept, but it is prone to flooding. The 100-year floodplain absorbs a lot of the north part of the site. This should give you a sense of it in 3D. So the street to the north is called 45th Street. The one that goes through is Avenue G. And the one on the left now is Avenue H, and you can see it dead ends on the creek, and it's just used for parking. We looked at several precedents. This is the building itself. I think she designed it. Because it's a little eclectic, shall we say. This is Elizabeth May herself, back in the day, doing a plaster. This is the interior of that museum right now. These are mainly plaster casts, but she did work in stone and bronze as well. We looked at some precedents, of course, Scarpa, and how he arranged not too different sculptures, actually. Needless to say, this was aspirational. We also looked at Aldo van Eyck's sculpture museum. Basically an outdoor building with a plexiglass roof. skip that because we never got to this. Here we are back at the May, and the proposition was that this new museum, which is quite large, would extend or somehow recontextualize the old May with a new kind of modern portrait sculpture. So these are just some examples of the kind of work we imagined might be in our museum. Now, when we rendered our museums, we could not obviously find 3D models of these. So there's some license taken with the that was me dissing Miss Van. This was for me a model, of course, of what we could do. I'll leave it at that. Okay, so we have 4 people we're going to look at this afternoon. We're going to start with Zulin. Zulin, are you ready? Yes?
Yes.
Okay, so Zulin is doing screen share, and here she goes.
So okay.
Zulin, wave at the camera so they can see you.
Hi, I'm Celine. I am a second year MR student, and just wonder if everyone hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
So, okay, so I'll start it with a list of the name. So, located in Hyde Park, the museum was her studio and also served as a salon space. So I think in a way has embodied her personality and cultural background in the building. While the interiors of the building is interesting, the standing alone and the close-up appearance of it didn't attract many visitors right now. So my intention for the new museum is to create an extension that helps to activate the old name while preserving the landscape and inviting more people to enjoy the arts and nature. Located in the Hyde Park community, the site is next to the community park. So my initial thought was to create a courtyard that's embracing the park, so the museum ties into the neighborhood and becomes a super park. I then iterated with different ideas to have a square walkway with museum components on the corner to open up the site so people can flow into the courtyard from all directions. Here are some precedents I studied, and each inspired me with different features. So the Maneo collection used cluster and courtyard to create leisure space for community. And the Scar Park designed inviting moment that makes people want to explore behind the wall. So the third one is the Nordic Pavilion, with its sleek look and grid system. And so finally is in the Modern Art Museum, Tadao Ando designed the encounter sculptures in an enclosed space to have dialogues with sculptures. So this is my site plan. The design is to create a covered walkway that connects 4 components of the museum. The walkway itself is an object that provides shady space for sculptures and public activity. So, can you see my cursor? Yeah. So here, it's the new, it's the old museum, and here this one will be the new museum. This side, this one is the storage, and with the unloading area on the side. And this one is the cafe where we seated in the existing beautiful trees. So here's some parking for staffs, and the visitors parking, we're just going to be street parking. So here's the plan. So on four corners, four intersect to create unexpected moment with sculptures while weaving into the building. So I want the experience to be rich, and I also want the move flow to be simple. So I adopt grid system and simple geometry. And here, this one, on this side, it's the gallery. And this is the hall of the museum. And on the other side, this will be the office space. So the only will serve as the salon, which restore its historic use. And here's in the art storage building will be the installation workshop. And here will be the art storage, and here will be the mechanical plant. So this one, oh sorry, I forgot to mention, this one is like on the level 0, and this one is on the level 1, because it's higher on this side. And this is the upper floor of the main museum. So here will be another galleries for permanent exhibition, and here will be the hologram galleries. And here's the exploded axon. So the beam is deeper than required, as I wanted to create a slender and elegant look of it. This is the elevation from 44th Street. So from 44th Street, the old and new may standing next to each other and creates dialogue and welcome people to explore inside the walkway. And here is the section. And on both sides of the 44th Street and 45th Street, large graves are preserved for the community to jog and walk the dog. And this is how it looks sitting in the heart of the museum. People can enjoy both art and landscape when they sitting inside the courtyard. And here's the experience on the walkway. People see the sculptures with procession, and the platform is free for people from all directions. And the last rendering is about the unexpected moment with the sculptures when we walk onto the walkway. So I also make some models for the museum. So on the left is the museum with a roof, and on the right is without the roofs and how it looks like. I think this may help us to understand my design more. And so this is a closer look of the new museum. It's on the upper floor, the gallery space here, and the hologram space here. And this is on the lower floor of the museum, with the galleries here, the hall here, and the offices space here. And last are just some perspectives I took from the models. Here's how the entrance on the 44th Street of the main museum. And this is the entrance from the walkway. And this one is how it looks like sitting in the cafe in this corner. This one is just seen from the streets. And this one, last feature is about the experience looking from the community park across the street. Yeah. So I brought my models there. So yeah, you're interested in the questions. Yeah, thank you.
You see this, guys?
Yeah.
What are you asking, if we can see the model or something?
Trying to hold up the model for you.
Oh, yeah, you
No.
probably need to turn off the background or something so that.
Hold enough light on here. That camera's not on?
No.
Oh, jeez. Never mind then. How do we do this? Okay, log on your iPad. Okay, you're gonna get a tour in a minute. You're gonna get a flyover on the iPad. Oh, I see. The room camera is not working. That's what we're finding out.
Yeah.
No, that's all.
Okay, well, this is sufficiently spooky.
How do you pronounce your name? Sulin or Tulin?
Susan,
Tulin? Okay.
TSULIN.
Okay, I was just wondering if the Z was silent or there was something that I had to do with my tongue to make a sound. But anyways, what is that little, whatever that is, kiosk or?
A cafe, I think it's a cafe.
Oh, that's a cafe. Okay, it's hard to hear because of there's a kind of reverberation in the space
Yeah.
when you guys are talking. That I can't totally hear everything. I think just generally, just to open up, my first impression is, wow, I like it. Sometimes I'll see a scheme proposed by a student that makes me want to work on it. Yeah, and this is one of those. Just the initial sort of your intuition about how do you actually incorporate the site into this project, and you do that by basically making the entire site the space of the building, at least potentially. I could go into a lot more detail, but where I would begin to work on it is to look at what the space of the site flows through this courtyard or arcade or however you want to refer to it. What I would be interested in looking at is how the space from here becomes the space in the buildings. It's nice to have the buildings be they're engaging. At least when you look at it from above, they become part of the courtyard. But when you look at the walls that separate them, I couldn't really see whether or not your intention was to have the space in the areas where they overlap. Your intention was to merge them or to keep them completely separate?
So my intention of those walls is trying to living into the buildings, and so at the corners, because of the wall separates the space, so people will encounter with the sculptures at the corners, and that's something I see. I really interested in the modern art museum of forward. So I'm kind of thinking to incorporate that design in that features in my design.
I heard you speaking, but I didn't really, it wasn't legible.
Listen, you see there's a tile, one of your windows will be called Tanashi. That's his camera. See if you can enlarge that window by pinning it. If you click on the little 3 dots there, you can pin, you can just go in.
Yeah, I can see it bigger now. It's looking down on a paper model.
Okay, so tonight I should fly it around like a drone around the outside.
Maybe I'll just jump in real quick. Sulin, I think it's a really beautiful plan, and I like the idea of organizing it around these 4 kind of themes of the courtyard, the moment, the grid, and the encounter. I think you've done a really good job in plan, and I guess my question would be, like, if you look at the plan, could you switch to the plan really quick? Of course, whenever you create a grid system, you're then going to look like immediately at where do you break the grid and why do you break that grid? So there are like little moments where you decide to do that, where you extend the wall, not quite to the grid, and it just doesn't quite fit. And so you wonder, is that in relationship to one of the other themes? Is the grid broken because you're trying to produce a moment, or you're trying to create an encounter, or you're trying to, is it part of the courtyard? So I would look at a little bit more how these four terms start to overlap, and not only overlap synthetically, but sometimes have to compromise against each other. And then more importantly, I think you're doing it really well in plan, but then, of course, we're walking through space, and all of these moments and encounters are really in three-dimensional vertical space, less in plan than they are vertically, through your gaze at them in three dimensions. And so I wonder if the grid is what gets lost three-dimensionally. If you look at your sections, and also the site, which is like clearly not gridded. There's a lot of topography to the landscape. There's a river running through it, or a creek. And so if you were to take that same grid and apply it vertically in section to the project, would that start to reorganize the information in a way that you might actually highlight encounters or moments, because they start to vary from that new constraint that you've imposed on it? It reminds me a little bit of, like, Rem Koolhaas talks about the countryside, and how they applied the grid to the countryside, and just sort of took the entire country and applied a grid over it, regardless of how it interfered with the existing context, and then what you might do with that, and the kind of peculiarities that created. But I think I would look a little more at those four concepts and how they start to merge together and actually interfere once in a while with each other, so they actually stand out as moments that you're trying to create within the project.
I think, sorry, I'll jump in again. Sometimes, well, first of all, I agree completely with Michael's comment that when I saw the plan, I immediately thought, damn, I wish I could have come up with something that good. The plan is just the perfect move, this rather surrealistic framing of a creek bed. And so all of that I really enjoy, but there's a lot of missed opportunities. And I think it's because there's a lack of, I guess, diving into what some of these things are, because we're using the word courtyard just as a kind of thing that it looks courtyard-ish, but in fact, it's not really a courtyard, because you don't use the yard. It's something that you stare into, but you don't walk into. So traditionally, a courtyard has a quad of some variety. This is more of an ambulatory or an arcade that resembles a courtyard. And the arcade that rolls around the outside is this kind of wonderful experience of almost like a film. And you even created these rectangular arcade openings as if you're watching a film slide by as you move through the ambulatory. But I would recommend a couple of things. First is looking deeper into what a courtyard is. Generally, there's a yard. In this case, there's some kind of a yard, although it's not accessible. There's some kind of an arcade, which is the thing you walk through. And then there's some kind of court. Court meaning a set of buildings that create a space between them. So it's actually a courtyard consists of at least three things: a yard, an arcade, and a court. The other thing is that because you're going across a creek, you're creating both a building and a bridge. And I think I saw somebody earlier X out some of those things, that because you sort of created a building on either side of the creek and then made a bridge in between, whereas the entire thing could be a bridge. There's no reason why it has to kind of get the elephant's foot down on the ground on either side. It could have a little more delicacy to it. And finally, if you were to put all those things together and start to evaluate them as you drew your project, it might have brought it into a different world where it didn't feel so much like a domestic hotel. I mean, it has the colors and everything. It feels a bit like a Marriott courtyard or something like that, or a place where there should be a swimming pool in the middle of it or something. And I think all of that's because you didn't kind of dive deeper into what it is that you had created, because what you created is really beautiful. That's just a kind of maybe a general comment, maybe not too useful, but that's where my head is at right now.
Should I call on someone? Why did someone?
I would like to jump in, Michael.
John.
I appreciate the project as much as everyone else that has spoken so far. Um, I would like to piggyback on the last comment. It seems to me strange a little bit, Julien, that you have handled the square so uniformly. If one took the view that maybe you've got two banks and then two bridges, that might have allowed some differentiation. If one maybe considered opening up into a C shape rather than completing the square, I realize that would require people to backtrack, but it might have created different opportunities for using the buildings as culmination points, because I agree with the first comments that the attachment, the way that the buildings attach to the square is not fully resolved. But the main thing in my mind is I'm reading this partly as Stoa and partly as ambulatory or courtyard. And obviously I'm prompted to do that because you fill it with sculptures. Can we go to that render where you show the sculptures in the Stoa or in the in your ambulatory?
In the hall.
Can we go? Yeah, in the hall. Yeah. No, stay in the previous one if you don't. Yeah, here. So it seems to me that in a way that summarizes both potential and missed opportunity. You assume all the sculptures to be more or less equivalent in size in this particular view, and you assume the viewer to be not particularly interested. So, and of course you might have this kind of parataxis of sculptures, but I'm surprised you go in that direction, given that you did look at Scarpa as one of the precedents for the studio as a whole. Would there not be great opportunities to have special moments along, depending on the size and the height of those sculptures? And perhaps if one varied the width of the square so that it's not a totally uniform, relentless square, but maybe it has different conditions, would you not allow curators to situate those sculptures in a greater variety of architectural contexts so as to build on their dimensions or on their expressions or on the way that maybe they might talk to one another? So it seems to me that this particular slide here kind of summarizes a relentless intent to go for sort of uniform parataxis and repetition, when in fact your partie would also allow for, if you wanted, some degree of differentiation. And I'll stop here. I think you get the gist.
Thank you, John. Nicole.
Anyway, what conjured in my mind, listening to you, John, is I'm beginning to think. I was wondering, like, if these sculptures had, like Toy Story, they come alive and they basically find their own place in the building. I remember that when I was going back and forth between Bernini and Borromini for a week in the two chapels in Rome. And one of the things that you know, they're very different. They're similar in size, but very different in terms of what the takeaways are. But one of the things that I always remembered was Bernini putting sculptures in weird places, like a little cherub falling off of some ceiling detail. You know, and then I started thinking about what are all the other ways sculptures have been put into buildings. You know, the sculptures that replace columns that hold up the building. There might be sculptures that are related to the water. I'm wondering if one of the ways that you begin to study or look at how do you go beyond the static nature of the building is that maybe the building is relatively static, but then where the sculptures are positioned aren't predetermined by basically the geometry of the building, you know.
Yeah.
They're all over the place.
Getting a lot of critique about the repetition.
And that would actually, I'm looking at Craig's point is how do you basically move beyond the conventions of what you already have in your mind about what a courtyard building is. And then you basically just sort of draw out that memory, and that's what you put in here. And then even if that's how you start, how do you begin to mess around with that? You know, how do you break out the corners? Like one of the floor plan drawings with those corners extending out a little bit. When I heard one of you talk about those corners, I started thinking about, okay, what if you started to introduce a pinwheel into this thing where the corners never really close themselves? They basically extend out. So all of a sudden you're starting to suggest that the entire site, all the way out to the street, belongs to the building, so that you now have a courtyard, which is in a more or less introverted space, but then the building starts to move out in a way that suggests that this is really part of the greater neighborhood, and it becomes more extroverted.
Let me just interject here, Michael. I'll take some responsibility for that, because in earlier phases of this design, the courtyard was more playful, it was more varied, she had sliding planes, and I strongly encouraged the courtyard to be more Aldo Rossi-esque, to be more like.
Well, I don't think anybody's got to take responsibility. We're just talking about creative process.
But then, Michael, if that would be the direction, then I guess there might be opportunities to play a little bit with proportion, because if it was Aldo Rossi-esque, it would be taller and maybe narrower relative to its height, so that one would get then. I mean, here I get a sense of horizontality in terms of viewing. The whole proportion is pushing things laterally, and that is then confirmed by the placement of the statues in the voids between the columns. And so if one played that game, then one might play with verticality versus horizontality and create variety in that way.
The idea would be to find something that can vary against this purity. But anyway, I'm going to pass it on to Elizabeth.
Thank you.
That microphone's big.
Okay, great. Let's see, I will say, I think, Sulan, I was here on the mid-review, and I feel like you've made a lot of progress since then. This model is really quite wonderful. And I appreciate the way the project is quite delicate in terms of using the outside spaces as places of display, but is also actually taking, it's an institutional scale project. So it sort of combines, it brings a sort of light touch to the site. I think that's a really nice move. And I think some of the things that I really appreciate, being on the Friends Committee, this addresses a lot of discussions that we've had about how can the museum start to better access the north side of the site, which is really interesting and bounded by a really busy street. So I like the way this would give a presence to 45th Street for the museum, and it would make it a really natural part of the circulation of the building to take people over to that other side, which is actually really kind of has its own interesting history. And I agree with the comments about the uniformity of sculpture and experience. And I think one of the things that's interesting about what you're doing here is you're essentially sort of framing the weird creek that happens there. And currently it's kind of messy and changeable and eroded, and it's got a historical dam on it, and it has all this kind of weird stuff. And I like the idea that there would be this sort of pristine frame put around it. And then thinking about, can you then apply that to sculpture? And I think that's where using the, imported symbols or blocks of sculpture sort of gets you in trouble, because you can scale those up and down. And in reality, there's a whole sort of difference and messiness to the sculpture that I think your museum would have a hard time responding to, as has been mentioned. The things that I think, the places that are potentially very interesting, I like the walls that slide out into the landscape, sort of imagining that there could be a sculpture in front of one of those walls. So you would start to extend the experience out into the site itself. And that visitors walking around would see their own body in relation to the sculpture and the wall, and that the sort of walls extending out could become a bit of a framing device. I think the elevation facing Avenue D, is it on the
H.
west, H?
No, G on the left.
G on the left. Across from the new pool and park area, I think that elevation can be really pleasing. I think the one from G, where you're seeing the existing museum, I think it would really benefit you to draw the actual museum and sort of think about using the specificity of that building as a way to develop the language of your articulated new building. And it frustrates me that it's about 10 feet in front of the facade of the May, because that facade is, you know, so iconic to the museum, and it seems like it could have been, you know, just, you know, like zoning, hold the front edge, or, you know, either be really clear that, oh, this is our new museum, and then if you want to see the existing one, it's back there, or to really line them up. And I feel like
But
you're
it's much more punchy, the old one. I mean, she's done a very quiet facade, so it is more forward, but I think the old museum's
gonna hold its own.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're probably right there. So
thank you, it's great. Nicole.
I think oh, I don't need to do anything.
No, the microphone.
Right behind you.
Oh, hi. Okay. Didn't know. All right. So I think all the comments have been said, really. The only thing that I would say is, one, I was the bridge person, like make it a real bridge. The little things that encroach on the creek, I don't think need to be there. So really span it. And then I drew a little bit of an orange view from your art storage into that relatively large landscape with big oaks with to the north of the site. And I think by having, I think it's a missed opportunity programmatically to really just have that as a storage building. I do like a lot what Elizabeth was suggesting, that these bridges, which are ambulatory and contemplative, also take us from one side to the other. And so I think the development of that is good. And I'm just a little disappointed when I get to the other side. Actually, there's nothing programmatically for me to go to. It's just the ambulatory and that storage. Does that make sense? So it doesn't stitch together both sides of the creek programmatically as well as I think it could have.
I'm trying to arrange the installation workshop that has the glass.
Can you show us some plan or another drawing so I can see?
Yeah, it's.
Oh, that little thing?
Yeah, little thing, and it's
Okay.
that has a glass front, so when people walk there, people can see the workers working on the fix the sculpture or something.
Right, but I mean, I've been to this area quite a bit. I've been in the landscape more than I've been in the building. And that's partly due to the hours and when I'm there. But I think the presence of the landscape is very, very significant. So I think your museum has the potential to stitch together that landscape in a way that hasn't been done with the existing building, which is really an object in the field, quite literally a field. And so I don't think it's enough to just be able to look into that. But it's really nicely done. I actually appreciate, I don't personally like graphically the grid and plan. In fact, I would remove that because it sort of hits me over the head. It's like, I get it. But I do like the rigidity of the architecture as long as I can begin to understand its tension, positive tension with the landscape, as well as with the sculptures on the inside. So it becomes really that frame between these things that are quite mutable and changing.
Does anybody know the architect? I'm sure some people do on the call, Dom Hans van der Loon from the Netherlands. Last name is Vanderlaan. He did this beautiful monastery in a place called Valls, which is not the one in Switzerland, but the one in the Netherlands, together with an expansion of Dominicus Bohm project. I think it's Dominicus. Anyway, the way that architect uses the simple plans, in my mind, is more subtle and more sensual than, say, throwing out a name like Aldo Rossi or even Albert Speer. The way he works with the surfaces of the columns and the way the light kind of reaches different parts of the courtyard are really quite beautiful. So if you haven't looked at him, Sue Lin, take a look at that project.
I will, thanks.
I'll type it in the chat.
Yeah, I'm looking. It's not like your project.
Yeah, Michael, why didn't you bring this up before?
Where is it? You found it? Are you looking at it?
I have the book that he wrote.
Yeah, the book is spectacular.
I think we're all agreeing it's a beautiful plan, and it's so carefully done. But I think though partially it's the software. The software has gotten you because you're making the walls, then you're putting square holes in the walls, and then applying it. Like if you just took the very same building and put real materials on the walls, it would look, I think, quite different if it was thought through structurally. I fancy, I know we've all been thinking about putting sculptures on the courtyard, on the square, but now that I see it here, I kind of think it would be interesting to have sculptures everywhere except on there.
Yeah, so do I.
They were like out in the landscape, and that was spectacularly empty and clean, and you kept looking into the landscape to see the sculptures, and then you'd have to get out and walk around to see them. But it was more like flying first and not having them be with you so close. I don't know. I think it's a beautiful plan, and Elizabeth, it's really, this one strikes me as like you could almost do it, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be.
Don't you think? I mean, in terms of like what could go, because we're gonna see a lot of them that are like, no way we can build this. But this actually looks like we could fly.
It definitely, I think urbanistically works really well.
So it's urbanly, and there's a quietness to it, and it picks up the old museum like no problem. I was going to be here anyway. Oh, here's the museum, you know?
Yeah, I just wish it had a little more spicy brown mustard or something.
A little more.
A little mustard.
Yeah. Okay, so then we need mustard. Okay.
Hey, Michael, I have a question for you. Michael?
Sorry, Mom.
Oh, I'm looking at this site plan, and did you talk about the corners with her? How those pavilions hit the corners?
Yeah.
Two of them sort of avoid, and the other ones just don't even acknowledge that it's sitting at the corner. And I'm thinking about it just, in terms of the corner was like a really big deal for Lucan, and so that became a whole study in and of itself. But I'm wondering, maybe you didn't. You could just say, no, we didn't talk about the corners much.
All right, we're going on to Victor.
Thanks a lot. Good fortune in your future.
Hello? Hey, there we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Victor Troutman. I'm a graduate student here at UT. Thank you for taking time today to give us feedback. My project, I'm going to start by just showing you guys a quick 4-minute video that will hopefully sort of allowing you to place yourself mentally in the space as I'm describing it after the video finishes, and just give you an idea about maybe some of the story or the narrative or the feeling that I'm trying to generate from the building that I've designed here. So let's see. There's sound. Hopefully this translates. Okay, so that was a little bit jerky on the shared media screen, but I think that worked out okay. So so in general, sort of big picture, the nave addition that I've created here is it's situated on the eastern edge of the site in order to minimize the disturbance of the site's what I feel are the site's important conditions on the western corners of the site. The new building sort of extends north to south, bridging the two sides of the site that are bisected by Waller Creek. And the current condition of the creek, I felt, left a lot to be desired when I visited the site. So creating a dam condition underneath the building itself to sort of activate that creek and help it sort of enhance the landscape a bit more and become more of a featural part of the landscape. And then the design of the new nave is one that aims to activate through intrigue. So the outer shell of the building that spans the Waller Creek and engages the existing nave museum creates a bridge of voluminous enclosed space that's capped at either end by the existing nave museum at the south and by the new hologram gallery at the north. The space between these two termini provides a visually open and programmatically versatile space for sculptural pieces to be displayed and space to start to be defined. And then the museum's sculptural storage actually turns into something of a display piece within the gallery as well. It's located above the main gallery space, floating overhead like a giant cabinet of curiosities. The volume works both as a storage and as a light box space. It's capturing and diffusing sunlight from the roof into the main gallery space, and its large frosted glass window walls reveal hazy phantoms of the artifacts that are stored overhead. So this is that main gallery volume space. And then as you can see overhead, there's sort of these hazy sort of ghosts of the number of, you know, whatever types of modern sculpture would be stored and cycled throughout the season at the museum. So this was designed really with the idea that there's very few pieces that are displayed in the main space of the gallery. There's only a couple that are ever really down there. And then the majority of them are stored in storage, but because of the way that the storage is situated, you can still get a suggestion of you know, what is available and what's here, and that storage space becomes another sort of iconic object within the larger volume that's defined by the arched roof.
I forgot, could you remind me, are there two bridges? The building is a bridge, and was there a second bridge which was just a pedestrian bridge, or no? I forgot.
The pedestrian bridge exists essentially just directly adjacent to.
It's part of the building. There's not a second separate bridge. I couldn't remember from the site plan.
There's just this second, there's a.
Okay.
And that also serves as a platform to start to shade that western facade, to sort of control the light that's coming through that large open space. And these two shading systems here are big, you know, bay doors that could be open or closed depending on the weather, and sort of activating the interior space in an interesting way. Yeah.
That's it. Okay. Maybe we'll let the locals start. We'll go in reverse order.
Sure, can you go back to the section?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so curious, and maybe it's easier if I annotate. What is the purpose, with the exception of maybe the pedestrian bridge, but what is this space for?
So these two spaces, the sculptural storage here, this is sort of acting as something, yeah, something like you know, sort of casting that light and then dabbling it down the curved vault overhead.
But do you feel like he's not showing sculpture? Is that?
Well, it's got it, when we look at the site plan, it has a strong presence, and everything that you described seems to happen in this zone.
Mhm.
And I was wondering if I need the rest of the building, like the glowing surfaces, meandering through the columns, bridging over from one side to the other, the light from above, the storage. So it seems like there's some extra pieces. And so I don't mind imagining that the building is a little bit more within the zone of the area where you're talking about performance. And so that's why I asked, because I felt like I was missing the role of some of the rest, like, 50% of the building. And so it's really more of a question, and it's maybe not a good place to begin, so I apologize. But, what do you think about that? Like, is that, what am I missing? Why is that other stuff really important?
Well, I think that you need sort of the absence of space to really start to better define the object, the sculptural storage as sort of this object that's floating above your head, right? Because the objects that are stored within that are these really heavy, potentially super weighty objects. That storage pod itself is also visually this really, heavy thing, but I wanted to give it the idea that it's floating, so these columns are not really even visually touching. And then I think the fullness of that space around that floating cabinet of curiosity, whatever you call it, I think that helps define that as sort of this really,
I think
this object with a lot of mystery and intrigue.
Nicole, would you be happier if we looked up into that big vaulted space?
No,
If there was something up there, that there was a little balcony or?
No, but when I look at like the last image that you just had, what really pushes the floating aspect is the green of the landscape beyond. And so for me, just as a thought, and maybe I'm sure other people will disagree and that's great. But as a thought, I could get a sense of that floating with landscape. Like I could back up and see a lot of floating, and I'm not sure if that other volume is as powerful. Because I actually really like the storage and seeing things in the belly of the building. Like you're below the storage, and that's where you choose to present things. That's very intriguing to me.
And Nicole, I have a alternative way of putting your point forward maybe, and that is a question. If Michael had not provided a program with as many square feet as it had, would it have still taken on this broad position, or would it have gotten tighter? Is this a response to the square footage, or is it a deliberate approach, I guess is a good way to ask it maybe.
Yeah, if you're giving me an excuse here to blame Michael for it, yeah. 100% Michael's fault. And
because I brought that up at the last time I was talking, if the square footage is an issue, it's a sculpture museum, so much of it can be put outdoors. Not everything has to be inside a building. So you could cut your gallery space, indoor gallery space, probably in half and still have a great museum. In fact, maybe even a better museum. Louisiana is a good museum, and case in point, a lot of museums you move in and out, and that's what makes them great for sculpture. So I think the question is intriguing to me. Are you really wanting all that space, or is it just you feel you had to do it?
See, I feel like if I were getting this critique, I'd be going, here's what these people are worried about, is that these gigantic flanks, aisles, you've populated most of the sculpture under, and you've left the side as though for heavy traffic. It's like there's something about that emptiness which doesn't feel called for or necessary. It just seems extravagant, maybe. So I think, yeah, the extravagance is part of it, that's generosity. But I think there needs to be some activation up there, some destination, some overlook out. Something's got to happen that goes, oh, I know why it's this big. I feel like we don't know why it's that big.
Yeah.
Except something significant.
Yeah, I'm going to rest my comment. I'm done. I'm
That's a
done. We
great
can
point.
talk about
No,
other
this is-
things.
These intuitional things, sometimes we don't. It's
Well-
like he sensed it, I mean, created it. I think we all want it.
Well,
I had the exact same comment. So I'd agree with Nicole. I mean, for me, you have a really amazing building that's covered up by a lot of other stuff. And I agree with Nicole, it's maybe even 50%. Like you have this really great building that's four, if you look at the section, it's like four chunks. You have one that's the water below, right? And they're all dealing with transparency in different ways. You have the water below, you have this open zone right here, you have the blurred zone here, and then you have the sky zone here. And it's really interesting, like different bars of transparency. So all this other stuff that's like shrouding it, the diagonals, is totally irrelevant to what you're trying to set up sectionally. That's super interesting. And what it comes down to me is then how do you transition between the open and the water, or between the blur and the open? And so you've already hinted at you wanted to separate those, and like the articulation of that detail is super interesting. I don't know that it's the right articulation of detail, because you're taking something and you're trying to disconnect them, like one structural strategy versus another structural strategy to separate those, where on between the sky and the blur, you actually curve the building, and that allows the sky to sort of bleed into the blur zone, which I think is really interesting, where you create a non like very striated condition, but one that starts to hover between, you know, are we in the sky? Is it just the curvature of the building that's pulling the sky into the blurred zone, or is the blur kind of moving into the sky? And then with between the floor here and the water down here, there's almost no transition, right? It's just solid. And then you have the water below, where maybe this kind of strategy becomes a perforation on the ground and actually starts to open up and create a blurred condition between the open, you know, sculpture park and then the water below. And suddenly it's the transition of these transparencies. Really interesting. I mean, I really like this image. I really like this image in particular.
Yeah, I think that you show a lot of skill here, so I'm gonna be pretty hard on you, honestly. I think there's a certain trick to, I mean, I love the idea that this big building would be hiding behind the name. And so from dead on, you just see the historic museum, and then you go around.
Yeah,
And
that was
there's
a
this
great
whole
shot
other
when you
world
see
that's-
past it,
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's a great starting point. It's a really good idea. I also think there's a certain sort of trickiness to, hey, let's put all these heavy, precious sculptures up. Like you know, there's logic to that, but I can understand the appeal of that. But when I look at the renderings, I'm dying for you to edit. There's just so many different systems sort of clashing with each other, or not happily integrated into a single sort of calm vision, because I feel like there is, like, as has been mentioned, the view out towards the landscape, I think would be wonderful for the sculptures, and would have a very sort of sense of abstraction, lifting you up off the ground and putting you in relation to art. And I think that could be amazing. But then there's a gridded ceiling, and then there's mushroom columns, and then there's diagonal screens, and they're all sort of taking away from each other in a way. And I would love to see you pare it down further and just really hone in on that sort of singular idea.
Sort of more minimalist, maybe more industrial.
Sorry,
perspective.
following on that point, I wanted to ask you, like, why did you make your waffle slab like sort of 45 degrees as opposed to keeping it sort of on grid? Like, I'm curious why you did that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, it's a good question. I don't even never really know that it crossed my mind to do it on grid, and for, you know, for whatever reason, I think I initially started looking at, you know, precedents. I was looking at stuff like the Palazzetto dello Sport in Italy, and really just kind of going from that as a general precedent. So yeah, I'm not sure that could change a lot.
You know, I didn't think this, I was just curious because like you brought up the point, I was like, oh yeah, I see it, how it's like it's almost a little bit busy. They're not reading cohesively, as cohesively. But yeah, no,
They had changed scale. Rhoda, would you like to throw your hand in?
Yeah. Oops, sorry about that. a number of things that I was thinking about just by listening to all of you. I began to think about the first thing that triggered it was talking about the space, and I started to think about the space in the same way we think about time interval in sound or music, silence, and quite often we architects think of space in terms of how efficient it's used, as opposed to what is the distance in between things? What's the size and the proportions of the space? You have little sculpture and big sculpture in here, and everything is equal, as opposed to how do you begin to use a big thing that seems too big for the space and a little thing that seems too little for the space. Just looking at this particular view with the weight, the heaviness of the material or matter, and then above it, the translucency, you have a seam. This begins, you're now starting to explore where matter and light come together. That in and of itself is a pretty extraordinary exercise. I think there's like the last one, there's really a lot here that the more you stare at, sometimes you got to look twice in order to see once. And I think this project, the way you presented it, made me have to slow down to the sort of the rhythm of the sound and the images. I would agree that there were certain things in there that you probably wouldn't notice missing, like those diagonal things. But I think the thing that's, when looking at the columns, for instance, and the separation of the column to the diagrid, which has real weight to it, and then the compression of the space because it's, I had a client ask me once when I was designing a place for him to meditate. He said, I want it tall, but not too tall. I want it short, but not too short. So I said, you want to be weightless. You want to feel weightlessness, don't you? And he says, yeah, that's what I'm after. And then, client will say things and they'll say, oh, do you understand what I'm saying? Can you do that? And you say, oh, of course. And then you go back to your hotel room and you go, holy shit, what was he talking about? And then the more you think about it, it pushes you off center. Like another client that asked me, he would be interested in doing his house, pushing complexity, literally pushing complexity in the house, if, even though it might be strange to his eyes, it was familiar to his body. And I went, my goodness, strange to the eyes and familiar to the body. So this has a lot in it that I think is could be mined. I see it as a sectional proposition, but you're not really using the section full tilt. Like how does a space not just stay stratified, but actually start to break through some of the boundaries, the horizontal boundaries that you've set? I think you've really got a lot of really potentially wonderful things happening that make me think about them. First, basically back to what I was starting to talk about, it had to do with setting up the binaries, space and silence, matter and light, size and scale, weight versus lightness, etc. So I think it's here. But how do you take it to the next step? That would be, I think, one of the things that would really make this project begin to hum.
Yeah, John.
Can we go to the axonometric for a second, Victor? I want to make sure that, yeah. Okay. My first impression, and I did like the project a lot and actually very much appreciated your showing the video at the beginning, is that I first of all, to begin with, like the contrast between the rather small and intimate rooms of the current museum And this very large platform that you're creating, it could be a magic carpet, it could be a raft, this very large platform that you create, almost like a ballroom for sculptures. And that I really enjoyed myself. And I wish that the other side of your platform was treated in the same way as you treated the museum side, by which I mean you let the platform be its own thing. On the museum side, you separate the building from the shed, let's say, whereas on the side where you're building the building, you let them collide. And I'm not sure that I appreciate that all that much, but it's secondary. The idea that I have this ballroom for sculptures and visitors, and on top of that, I have this kind of theater of shadows, really impresses me. And then the reason why I wonder how people manage to draw here. Let me see. Is it the annotate thing? Yeah. I wonder, I mean, I can see that you're bringing the light through here, and that's the light that will inundate the perimeter spaces. Am I correct?
Correct, yes.
I might even have played the roof to exaggerate that light. So if, for example, the roof had that kind of section with the light coming through and bouncing over your curve, you might have found ways to accentuate that. But if I had your idea that basically, if I look at this as a stage, it's ballroom versus theater of shadows, I might have found some pretext for getting people up here so that those shadows move. And I might have thought that storage is really those sculptures that are not arranged according to some sort of subtler curatorial philosophy, but the interested visitor might be allowed a glimpse through that storage. I would, in order to find something that moves along here, so that your theater of shadows is not always inert. And you see what my point is. There's ballroom with, I guess, regulated lighting. And then there is theater of shadows. And then the whole section of the building could amplify that idea. And I think that's very powerful. And what I'm reading here is simply a desire to have some sort of curtain. And I do agree with the comments that were made that it's a little bit heavy-handed, and I might have found much more lightweight ways of suggesting curtains, so to speak, which plays into this impression you gave me that it's all about staging, and it also stages landscape. Okay, I'll leave it.
Aside, it was a Western exposure, so we tried to.
Right, and so maybe a lighter screen might have done the job.
It's an interesting proposal, though, to deal with the screen and not just have it be something. As I've seen the project before, it's a series of numbers. So I think at least it's testing the waters, and I agree there are probably other options.
John, Victor and I did have the thought that the storage thing up there would probably be more popular than the open.
Yeah. Hey, I got a couple.
You'd have to pay extra to go up there, and that's how it works.
I got a couple of quick comments because I'm probably rounding off here. I seem to be very fascinated by landscape these days as an issue. And sorry, I used to hate it when I was a student and I had the juror who always said the same damn thing all the time. And I was like, oh God, now I'm turning into one of those people, so excuse me. But there's something that you said, and that was that the water of the creek was something that left a lot to be desired. And you wanted to clean it up and change it and make it into something else. You did, essentially you turned the creek into a pool, which is fair enough. But I just want to point out something. Creeks and natural conditions like this are not trying to be what we want them to be. They don't necessarily want to be manicured, or they don't necessarily want to be cleaned up. There's a lot of small creatures and little animals and things that live along the rough edges of a creek, which is why the Army Corps of Engineers and a lot of other people are very interested in what you do with the edges of water systems. So I just think be a little careful when you say, well, it's ugly. The last project that we looked at just framed it and left it and said, well, here it is. And I think this one, you've kind of really polished it up. That's fine. And I think actually you could do some wonderful things by creating a pool with life that exists along the Waller Creek condition. But you just need to, I think, recognize that making it pretty isn't always the best thing from a habitat or biodiversity perspective. And I've seen this happen many times where creeks like in Houston, where Bayou Creek, or I can't remember, the Buffalo Bayou, they cleaned it up and made it nice and it's all pretty. And now half the animals are gone. There are no more raccoons, there's no more, chipmunks. They all got pushed away because their habitat was erased. So I think just be a little careful with that. And the last thing I want to say is I was struck by one of the images that had the sign of the Ney Museum on, I think it was in the film, and it said the Sculptural Museum, which is intriguing because it's actually a sculpture museum. So I guess Sculptural Museum implies that the museum itself is sculptural. And I think this plays into something that I would ask you to contemplate. And I'm saying this from a voice of perspective because I've had the same problem. Who is it that you're doing these things for? Are we trying to impress people? Am I trying to impress myself? Like, what is driving me? And I know sometimes I get into this challenge when I see that I'm trying to impress somebody or impress myself, it always falls a little flat. When I introduce more self-reflection, which is going back to the issue of editing, a little more a pause about what it is I'm doing and why I'm doing it, that helps me in my work. Helps it find a place that feels like it's supposed to be. So I'm not saying you have this issue because I can't say that, I don't know you. I'm just telling you from my perspective. I have this sometimes, and it's something I have to think about. Self-reflection.
I think Craig's point about there's two terms that are present, but we don't talk about it much. Is the sixth extinction for one, but in any case, anthropocentric, which is everything is human-centered. Everything is here to serve us, as opposed to ecocentric, which is what we're dealing with right now, all of the crises. If you're going to be looking at modifying a creek, the first thing I would do is try to understand how would beavers do it? How would a beaver do it? Someone asked me about a year ago, which stunned me actually, and it got me into doing reading that I never expected to do. Are you smart enough to know what animals know? Yeah. I thought, wow, that's a weird question. And it turns out that this guy is an extraordinary mind, literally a genius scholar that bought a farm. And the reason he bought a farm, because his area was linguistics, he wanted to see how animals communicate with each other. So he put together a whole menagerie of animals that not to eat them, but to basically care for them and to watch them. And the stories that he began to tell me, and he moved from a bigger animal, which was a donkey, into what he calls grassroots, which is the microbiome. And I never much thought about the microbiome except for the interest that I had when I learned that basically what's happening in your gut is also the same thing that's happening in your brain. And that basically, when we talk about gut reaction, is like a brain happening. And so you begin to think about one of the biggest problems that we have right now for climate change is soil. We kill soil with all of our farming. And so in any case, I think you really have to think of how things begin in the soil and move their way up, and then begin to think about, as you're learning more about the complexity of those interactions, what is the architectural equivalent of this stuff? That's where precedent, I think precedent begins in the microbiome. It doesn't begin with, oh, let's look at, in the early phases, at the age that you're at right now, and I, again, knowing, as Craig was saying, that we reflect on the things that were about what we were once, and all of that never goes away. In the early phases, all I thought about was that architecture gave form to architecture. And then architecture gives form to life, which means that the architecture decides what life is going to be, vis-a-vis perhaps your pond. And then when you gain enough confidence and compassion and empathy, you reverse all of that. You say life gives form to architecture. That I think is where, if I would have known then what I know now, that's where I would have started. That's where I would have started. And then the architect is a person who is trying to figure out, how do I basically create the world that I want to live in? And that world is not a financial model. It's not a financial model.
Yeah, I think these are very timely, very beautiful thoughts. Somewhere between leaving the creek as it is and leaving everything as it is and turning it into a French park, you know, with like massive engineering to make a postcard. Somewhere in there is the right way to go about this. I myself, guys, I'm much more a humanist than an ecologist, I have to say.
Yeah, but humans are part of ecology. You can't.
I think
you
it's
can't
okay
put them
to
out.
tag a river. I
Oh.
do it. And I just think there are better and worse ways to do it.
I agree with you, Michael.
One of the reasons Victor so blithely got away with doing that is I more or less endorsed it as a thing to do.
No,
And I know that you have problems with that.
I'm not saying you can't do it. And in fact, I was tried to be very clear in my comment. I'm saying that if you do it, it needs to at least be a part of the conversation as to what the changes are. You can't do it blindly and or put it off as something we don't need to talk about because there's all these other things like door frame details to discuss. So you know, I think and I'm not proposing that you leave everything alone. That's not the point either. It's just that it's a component that is not at all discussed, and it should be a part of the conversation.
It would be a better world in which I, as a teacher, but in general, could talk about that creek as smartly as we can talk about skylights. And
Yeah. Yeah.
whether this approach is good or whether that.
Yeah.
Because the fact is, we do just kind of go, okay, this is someone else's problem.
I think it's also really interesting to think about the history of the landscape there, because it is a very sort of historical landscape.
Yeah.
Waller Creek originally was an oxbow going on the north side of the creek, so you can still sort of see the imprint of that. During Elizabeth May's day, they created a dam and and actually similar to what you're showing, they had a lake on that side, so it was bigger, and they have pictures of May and so on.
Yeah, I've seen the pictures, but they had a different drainage patterns in those days too. I mean, we didn't have streets surrounding the building in the way we do now. There was more pervious landscape.
It was on the frontier, essentially.
Yeah.
Like I said this morning, I'm probably going to do the studio again, another round. You guys are all invited. And I'll see if I can get some landscape students to be and keep them involved. Hey, thank you, Victor. Good job.
Bye-bye. I'm just going to step out for one quick second. Be right back.
From like the Friends perspective, I know Oliver, the director of the museum, he was always like, let's do a bridge. Let's do a bridge. So he'll be really happy to see you.
Do you know how this goes? You see me recently?
No.
All right, so next is Matt. Matt, you were sitting there because it's a little closer to the mic. And maybe everyone, we can take a 5-minute break. I need to take one myself.
Would you send the cards to Oliver?
Would you send it to Oliver?
I'd be really excited to see what else he was really enthusiastic about the last.
Yeah, just like super enthusiastic.
Yeah.
I just like and now. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Maybe you can use one of those trash bags. Yeah. I think it's possible. The stroke? No. The nicer Photoshop under behind it. The curtains like glitch. You say so. Yeah, right? That's all. Just left, just doing it out. Just doing Catholics left, right? Or it's not, I can't, because they're here, you say. True. I just been watching your video up there the whole time. Yep. No way. So cool. Probably after. I'm gonna my floor plans in spring. That's actually like a lot easier. Yeah, because it's Adobe, it just does Illustrator. And so you can just make the Illustrator. You just turn off all the layers that you want to, and then you just individually import those layers, and then you can just draw paths in Illustrator, like the points for where you want it to move. Oh, so and then you just copy and paste that in there, and then it just moves. So you guys are the people that like walk around. Yeah. I've done that before when I did Photoshop, and it was like 100 images like stacked on. Oh, it was so bad. No, like it just doesn't take long to learn, but it's like one of those things where it's like I know how to do that. I bet people look up such niche things, being like, how do you? I just watched so many YouTube videos. You can still hear what I'm saying. I'm gonna take the studio story. Yeah, just.
You guys are gonna do this, right?
Of course.
Is that a joke?
Yes. And made up.
Yeah, I don't like doing two professors twice because I know so many to get to know.
I've only had like one experience with that. It was like I had her like first year, but it was like 80 kids. And so like I didn't even know her. I had her for
That's it. Yeah.
Anyone like that? Given how much tariff is needed.
I thought it was optional. That was optional. I didn't take this. Sounds like I don't want to. Sure, I didn't detail.
Okay, we're back, guys. Almost back, almost.
With your sound on it.
Yeah, so what you do, you stay muted and everything, and then when you share, there will be like a little thing, percent. You just have to click on the dots and go down to share audio. And it'll just share that audio and video, even if it's not.
Okay, countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is Matt.
Hi, can everyone hear me? I know you guys can hear me. I'm Matthew.
Can the reviewers hear Matt?
Oh, yeah,
Yes.
awesome, perfect. We'll get going. Been a while since I shared screen. Okay, so the existing nave is similar to the sculptures that it houses. It's very static and massive and constructed of stone. So I wanted to contrast that. So the new nave is entirely dynamic and light and seems to rest and almost float above the site. In visiting the museums in Houston and Dallas and Fort Worth and other museums, I've noticed that for very obvious reasons, they're really tightly enclosed in a tight envelope. But the thing about sculpture, and specifically metal and stone sculpture, is that they actually fare quite well in the environment. And so I wanted to utilize that aspect of the stone and the sculpture, and in sort of a radical gesture, the entire ground floor is actually completely unconditioned and wrapped in curtain material that is slightly translucent and bellows in the wind, which reveals the sculptures to passersby, and utilizes the nice Austin climate, and allows wind, invites wind, sound, or wind and the sounds of the site into the building. So I have a video. That tries to show that.
I'm not seeing the film myself.
Oh.
Okay, someone's going to turn off something.
How does that mean?
Yeah.
I can see a film, but it's not animating. It's still.
And you need to start from the beginning, I think.
Yeah, I don't know why it's acting like that. Just you. I did the video.
If your Zoom is not moving. You just mute.
I am.
Oh, you are.
I'm going to turn your own sound down. Speaker.
Oh.
I heard a cuckoo bird.
Okay, is everyone seeing that? Oh, I can see it there. Okay. So the entire building exists as a network of interior and exterior courtyards, moving along various levels of opacity and indoor-outdoor conditions in different levels of enclosure. One thing to note about the site is I wanted to leave the entire northern half of the site, north of the creek. I wanted to preserve that and keep it as a space that the museum hosts activities, and for people to walk by and walk across and see the new nave reflected across the creek, as well as its proximity to bus stops and 45th Street to try and preserve some community space. One thing to note, the first thing you might notice walking up to the building is that there's no defined entrance apart from an ADA ramp and loading dock down here. So people can just walk up to the NA to try and further blur that line between what's inside and what's outside. As well, the only walls that exist are on the exterior, which form the exterior courtyards, which are sort of outside, but not quite outside. And then you would walk inside, which is inside, but not quite inside. And the only exception to this are two interior walls seen here. That gives structure to the stairs. It allows plumbing and HVAC to go to the second stories, and it further acts as sort of monolithic backdrop for sculptures. The entire first floor gallery space is comprised of two major components: a dark interior floor that contains all the sculptures, and a light wood outer walkway. This walkway, which you'll see in section, is higher in elevation than the interior courtyard. So that hides the curtains, so it looks like they just drop down. And then the only barrier between the exterior walkway and the interior gallery space is that transition from light floor to dark floor. Finally, I wanted to preserve the NA and revert it to a studio space and an homage to her and how she lived. So that entire space will be reverted to the way it was originally. The second floor is devoted mostly to a program that needs to be enclosed. So the second floor is actually enclosed in mostly fritted glass. And as well, there is a lower sculpture gallery here that encloses any sculpture that might be susceptible to the environment. So something possibly made out of paper, wood. And then another thing I wanted to note is this area up here, which is a study in a library, which gives views of the creek and the site across the creek, and further tries to establish the new museum as a public space and an open space where people just go and visit and study and walk through. This is the basement plan, and this just shows, this is just where storage and installation is housed. The installation workshop is also in the existing NA basement, so sort of continuing this NA studio above and the installation workshop below, and I imagine doing workshops down there. Oops. This is an exploded axonometric, and
There's a piece missing.
and I got really nervous. Here, this better shows the structure, which is mass timber construction made out of these timber columns and glulam beams and girders, which sort of relates to the interior of the NA itself. And also, I wanted to continue that contrast between stone, so trying to deviate from heavy materials. This also depicts how the building is quite tectonic, and how I wanted to show how all these pieces sort of lay and rest on top of each other very lightly, so nothing really molds together. It all sort of it's comprised of these planes that sort of slide past each other that you can see in the walls and these benches. This shows how the benches slide into the walls, which slide into this flooring, which is below the curtains. Further, these curtains are supported by these rods that extend past the roof and similarly rest on these posts, which then are wedged into the walls. Sectionally, I wanted to show this sloped roof. I paid a lot of attention to how I can make the, from the exterior, make it seem very, very light. And so this slope allows the curtain to take up the entire facade. And essentially all you see from the outside is this thin band above and this thin band of flooring below. And then as well from the interior, we're able to look up and see this huge expanse. I also wanted to highlight the skylights and how light interacts with the building. Oh, sorry. This section, I think, depicts well how the building rests on the site and slopes down. And I think it also shows its relationship to the nearby neighborhood on 44th Street, as well as how it creates this facade which would reflect on the creek along 45th Street. Further, I wanted to focus on this well system right here. So below the skylights, which have a similar profile as the roof in the courtyards, there is a stone well, a little depression, so that when it rains, water falls down and drains out of the building. This is just a wall section that further shows the roof and the flooring and how that is put together. So this is a track system and a misting system because knowing that it's unconditioned space, I was trying to think of ways to move people down. So there's this mister that runs along the perimeter of the building, and this is just that glass facade on the second story spaces. This is just showing looking out into the exterior courtyard from the interior. One thing to note would just be how the existing trees impact the massing of the building, and also how I wanted to just bring up those walls so that they cut off right at the tree canopy. To render from the beginning, also showing that dark floor, which contrasts against the white marble sculpture. Finally, just showing those trees in that courtyard space with the canopy completely covering the opening of the courtyard itself. So, yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Maybe we'll start with some visitors. Rhoda, you want to give it a start?
Kind of an incidental thing, that courtyard where the water comes down, I was wondering what sculpture would you put there to let the water hit the head of whatever a sculpture is?
The little peeing boy from Belgium.
That'd be,
Someone with an umbrella.
in the Japanese temple, one of the things that they historically did was show you what water can do when it's coming off of a roof on its way to the ground. And it's mesmerizing. You watch it for a very long time, and in contrast to the static nature of all of this, of the sculpture, something like that would be pretty wonderful. But it's nice to see that you've really considered in a conceptual way, but drawing it more precisely, a section of a building, basically. And, you know, the tapering of the floors out at the edge, and, you know, so you see a thin line moving all the way around the building, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
No, it's, but the one thing that I heard you say, that I was looking at the roof plan, is I thought you said that there's courtyards in the building. And on this one, yeah, is it just that one, or are there 4
There's two.
courtyard? Just those 2? Is that a courtyard right there?
That is the second story.
Ah, the second story. Because I think okay, yeah, there's one right there. It's nice just the idea of creating this sort of matte building, and then voiding out into it. So that's one thing that I picked up on. The other one was, I was looking at the striping in your plan. It's sort of like being at a baseball stadium and seeing how they cut the grass. I've always wondered how they do that. You know, the color of the grass changes. But then when I was looking at the striping, and then there was an alignment, I started to wonder, like, when you turn a corner, what do you see? Like you have these really potentially wonderful spots where all of a sudden you're inside and you see beyond the outside. Is that what you want to see? However, whatever direction you're going in, if you're coming this way, the same, you know, this way, maybe you turn the corner and you go this way. Are these moments in any way important to you? So I think that if they're not right now, they possibly could be, because then I thought that, you know, you could have made it simple by just, you know, going around it in a normal way, but you're turning corners. You're bending the
Michael,
walkway.
saying you shouldn't go around the corner?
No, I know. Well, you know, when you start a project, there is, you know, for years, we always used to say to ourselves, when, again, starting when we were younger, there isn't anything too simple that we can't make more complicated, you know. And then by making it more complicated, you're working yourself into a corner in order to work yourself out of that corner. And so I see the bending of all of this. And I say, oh wow, now what do I do with all of that bending? You know, like you have this stripe going right through that one, right there, and you have this stripe going right through that one. But then you don't have stripes going in the other direction, which is fine. But then what would make sense going in this direction? And then what would make sense in terms of the misalignments? And there's no answer right now, but then that's where you really have fun modeling and sketching. Those might be aside, they may not be of interest to you, but that yeah. But I like the fact that you've considered also in the beginning of your presentation how this thing goes together. So the building itself starts to have a kind of finer a character that comes from the detailing that sculptures may not have, except in the change of direction of the material, the texture and the pattern that you see in sculptures. Anyway, I'll stop there for now. I'm just sort of rambling, but I like the fact that this has a uniformity and non-uniformity built into it. Kind of engages me.
Yeah, the corners are informed by trying to preserve heritage trees on the site.
Mm-hmm.
And then those bands are just, it's just formed from a grid I created loosely based off the ney itself, trying to create this A-B pattern of hallways and gallery space. So the sculptures are actually only housed in these areas, and these are hallways that would be free of sculptures. And then there would just be this tiny little drop down here to these paths. And these are actually, I imagine these are filled with the similar natural grasses and wildflowers currently found on this part of the site.
Yeah, one thing, for instance, you possible is like right there, perhaps there's a wall. You could have just tried and say, okay, what if I blow out all of those corners and put the walls out in the landscape? And then there's something out there that you are surprised. Those are like the mini Easter eggs that are out on the site. So you try it and you see if how to extend. It's like taking if you take that, all the spaces contained inside there. If I take this and remove that fourth side and this becomes the fourth side, the space extends all the way out to there. It's a very simple device for,
These,
Well, I think we're doing it somewhat when you put
Yeah.
the walls out.
I don't know if I'm understanding entirely, just,
They
these are,
pulled some of the walls out, yeah.
mhm.
Start doing that, but not at the scale of the passage.
right,
Not
right,
like a-
not at that scale, but I can,
But like right now, the light bands are
that's,
about climbing up on the those, right?
and then those are just,
So take us through the building, just get inside. In real time.
so this is just showing.
No one can fly in space.
This is the interior path. Oh, it is. You can see how the sculpture is going to.
I'll jump in with a few comments. For those, Michael knows, Benedikt knows this, but I lived across the street from the Ney Museum for like 3 years, and I went there at least once a week for the entire 3 years. So I'm really close to the place. There are a couple of things that my experiences there tell me about this project being very positive. It is nice to walk around that site. Hyde Park is kind of open, but it's also, people's front yards, and you feel a little nervous, and, you just can't occupy space very easily. This project opens up the Ney to a way, in a way which allows you to just kind of, I could imagine when I lived there, just waking up and going over there and walking through and just being so excited. I'm sure every time I walk through, because I'd probably enter it a different way each time. I'd move around it in a different way. It opens up to a kind of surrealistic problem. And that is, of course, it is so open. And several people today have mentioned dog walkers, of which there are many in Hyde Park. I could foresee the weirdness of people wanting to walk their dogs through here. And, what do you do with that when it, takes a poops on the floor or something? It's an interesting challenge of it being in and out at the same time, very, very porous. And personally, I like that. I know that probably the museum itself wouldn't like it, and it's a big uphill battle to get something like this accepted. But I believe in your case, you've thought about it thoroughly enough that at least in an experiment like this, it's just wonderful. So that's one comment I have. And the other one is, the water, which was mentioned earlier, is quite intriguing, and the curtains together with the water create another kind of habitat. You will have a lot of birds in there. The birds won't just sit on the top, they'll fly in and they'll fly around in that space. And I find that also, from a visitor perspective, quite interesting. And I could imagine, the weirdness of all the birds sitting on the sculpture when they're not supposed to be. Now, again, from a museum perspective, from a management perspective, directing this museum, that would be a problem. On the other hand, a lot of sculpture sits outside, so it has to contend with the same thing. So I'm not saying it's a problem, I'm just saying it's a weirdness that one has to think about. The other thing that I want to say that I like is the penthouses, which I wish could have taken on a little more significance. So I mentioned this to Michael before, the penthouse that's in the Ney Museum that exists today, that tiny little room at the top. When I was at architecture school, I turned that into my own studio because in those days the door wasn't locked in the daytime. So I would just walk in, climb those stairs up, and made myself a little desk up on in the belvedere of the Ney. And these little things up there start to remind me of that kind of experience of getting up slightly above the tree canopy. What I would like to have seen maybe is a little more use of those things. These are kind of rather restrained boxes, which is nice, but could you occupy any of the roof? Could you make a smaller room up there that's just like you have to walk across the roof to get to that room? You know, maybe it's a small meeting room or a small study or a sculptor studio up there that's just one study and it's, you know, it's removed from the penthouses themselves. Could you have done a penthouse on top of the penthouse? You know, yet another tiny little bird nest like space up there could have been really cool. And I think those are the kinds of things that would work themselves well with the scale of the neighborhood nearby. But all in all, I'm going to stop talking now, but there's a lot of really great things here. I guess to reiterate what some of the comments have been, it's such a relief for me to see a building that's not afraid to be real, but at the same time is completely unreal. There's not, you know, this is nuts. This proposal is absolutely crazy, right? But it works in many ways, and it has a real study of the tectonics of how it can be built and what it means. So, gosh, it's a lot of good stuff here.
Thank you. John, would you like to? John,
You're muted.
Sorry, can we go back to the museum plan or the site plan, please? Yeah, here. So I love this project also, even though it is so unreal. It's actually a fascinating proposition. And I don't have many comments to add, but I might make two. The first one is that I'm tempted to imagine that as I enter this sort of forest of columns and this shaded area, and I discover the courtyards as the special moments that punctuate the experience, I would be tempted to almost have, let me see if I can find that trick there to annotate that. There we are. To almost have extended your museum so that the existing Ney museum is equivalent to one of these courtyards. In other words, there's various things one discovers after one goes through the curtain. And one of those things might be the existing museum, because the way you're handling it here, I find a little timid. You're neither allowing the existing museum to really shine. It's no longer the protagonist. And nor is it allowed to be a sufficient surprise to my taste. And I understand why you're coming in with those cuts. And I think that's actually good because it allows you to look through these sort of alcoves of nature in the same way that you can look maybe across the courtyards. But I don't understand why you don't align the perimeter to sort of try to be a little bit more explicit, that essentially I have a magic box, even though it's a box of curtains. And after I go past the curtain, then I'm greeted to a number of surprises. And maybe all the zigzagging has to do with trees, but what I'm saying is that I understand this move a lot better than I understand the deliberate misalignment of the main edges, but that's a secondary comment. So my first comment is that I would turn this into a surprise as much as the courtyards. My second, rather, you know, what I would love to consider if I had such a great idea as you did, is how I can diversify the floor a lot more. Because it seems to me, given the uniformity of the roof, other than the moments when you're cutting sort of the space for the courtyards, it's the floor that might do more than simply gently step down towards the creek. Maybe as it hits the courtyards, maybe it creates the kinds of sitting areas and the kinds of blurred borders that you were showing here. I really enjoyed your view of this area. And you seem to have been handling multiple levels and multiple textures so that within a short sectional dimension, you had all these textures. And I wondered myself if the same sort of logic, not necessarily the same solution, could apply in the interior borders around this border or that border. So in other words, the poetics of how you look down to the ground as carpet, not just to a uniform floor. And I'll leave it at that. But I love the project.
Great suggestion.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that Avenue H, you know, if you look out of the museum past the old man, you're just gonna see those houses and apartments and people's trucks and stuff. But to get out past the man and claim it one more time with one more wall and one more curtain, so that, you know, right now the name just feels like, oh, you're on the outside of this fantastic thing. What you want to say is you're on the inside of this fantastic thing. I'm sorry, your turn.
Maybe I'll make a real quick comment. Yeah, I agree with all those comments, and I just want to first say that I really appreciate the level of resolution of the project. I think the drawings are really nice. It's nice to see the details and the wall section, so we can talk about some of the, you know, how the material and the system is coming together to support the concept. One quick thing I would say is don't ever use the trees as the excuse for your design project. I mean, like the trees made me do it. I don't think you know, the project is interesting on its own. So like, yeah, maybe that helped form the form, but you know, I think you need to talk more about what you did with that decision as you move forward and not just let the trees, you know, do it. But on this section in particular, I think what's really interesting about your project is this idea of one space penetrating another space. So you have the, you know, with the skylight, you have the water coming down, and actually the environment of that space above is becoming the environment of the space below. And on to Craig's point, I think that could be a device that you use much more frequently. Like, why does the space not, you know, penetrate and come out into the roof over here? So this space starts to occupy some of that space. And then especially in the water, can you go to the section where you're cutting through that edge? Maybe it's the other section. Yeah, that one. I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity for this. I mean, you're constructing the water's edge only to construct it. Like, you're not really gaining much from doing so. You're just kind of destroying the creek there. But as soon as this starts to become in here, you know, as soon as that wall starts to become in here, or the building starts to cantilever over it, then suddenly it makes sense. It's doing more than just constructing that edge. It's actually becoming part of the space of the building in the exact same way that you're bringing rain in from above into the building, and you know, you're doing it in a few other locations. I really like that as a design concept, and I think the trees are part of that, right? The trees are carving away at the building. It's having to move around the trees. So you're using the environment to construct the form of the building. And I think you just need to highlight or maybe utilize that as a technique in a few more locations. But overall, I think really nice drawings and beautiful concept.
Thanks. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I think definitely this outer walkway, like what if that was down here and then you had this, like, you know, above, and so sort of like that condition where you're underneath the boardwalk almost, but then you can see the creek or something. Yeah.
Yeah, they're two different entities, right?
Right, yeah.
So Nicole.
Site plan, please. So this is a very big project for a space that isn't huge. And so I appreciate, everything John said, I thought was really good. And I think the internal landscape is something that doesn't happen on the site. In fact, the site with all of its grasses is something that you experience almost as if you're not in the garden, you're sort of looking at the garden. You know, so it has a scale or a sense that you're watching it or looking at it a little bit more than being in it at times, partly just the grasses, right? And so I think by bringing the landscape in, we could talk about the size of those spaces. Maybe they're too small, but by bringing the landscape in and beginning to have a garden is really interesting. So the mat building approach, I think, is great. For me, I don't think it needs to be on this side of the creek. And we have an opportunity with the full site. We know that the northern side of the site, although it has some nice trees and it looks really nice, it's really not occupied unless there's an event. I mean, it's passed by. And so it has a sound issue. It's beautiful, but, right? And so I could imagine this mat building being along that busier edge, having a public face, and almost to the south, it could be the landscape, like so that it's a little more radical for, in a sense. I mean, I do think, John, the encapsulation of the bay as another garden is really interesting. But I wonder if you could use all of the things that it does well as a big building, which is partly the literal size of the program, but also how you're making internal kinds of spaces. I know there's the screen, but if that couldn't deal with that juxtaposition of traffic, noise, and then unfolding to a landscape beyond, it's just a thought. But I think it's really an interesting scheme. I like the integration with landscape, that the design doesn't stop at the building and you're trying to figure out how they're stitched together. I think that's very successful.
Thanks. I definitely think.
You get asked.
I want to say I really appreciate all the development that's happened since the mid-review. The drawings, I think, have really developed in a really nice way. And I feel like it's a real question, the relation to the existing museum. And I like where you've landed with it, where from one side, the museum gets its sort of private place. That's the view that everyone is sort of familiar with the tower. And I think, I mean, it's a hard one. I like the idea of moving it to the other side of the creek, actually, but I also appreciate the sort of playfulness of the space inside between the floor and the roof. And can you go to maybe one of the perspectives from inside? I feel like the relation between wall and tree and sculpture. I really enjoy the idea of sort of wandering through this and the manipulation of the ground plane, and I appreciate the chamfered edges that would essentially dematerialize, although they're not looking very dematerialized here, but
The chamfer is not as gradual.
I think the trees look a little crowded. They probably need a little more space. And I assume that wood columns are coming out of being tree-like. Is that why wood? I don't know. Wood seems like not what I would have. I would have assumed you were trying to sort of dematerialize the columns and make them as least visible as possible somehow.
Definitely put a smaller cross section of steel. I think originally it was an attempt to get away from really hard materials like stone and steel, because that's what the sculptures were. Then the entire curtains were getting away from that. But I think definitely looking at it, especially in this view, there's sort of massiveness.
One of the things that we talked about, that we didn't talk about in the presentation, was using the ground for cooling.
Oh, right.
There was going to be
These are
fans, the ground under the roof, under the floor. Air was going to be drawn across it, right?
Yeah.
That's sprayed with water. I mean, there was a whole passive cooling strategy that either didn't make it in the design or didn't make it into the presentation.
The vents are still there, that can be seen in the floor plan. That's what these are, which divide the hallways and the floors. And
Maybe in the section. If it's in the section.
kind of, it doesn't really cut through the vent, it's kind of hidden. It's
Well, I don't know. For
Yeah,
me,
that
I
was
was-
a big technical about getting air to
But it's outside, so who cares? I don't get why you're trying to worry about HVAC at all.
Yeah,
Not HVAC, not HVAC, V.
Okay, yes, ventilation.
yeah, no, I think you could do it some simpler ways and.
There.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think it's essential. In fact, I could see it this minute too. You'd probably have to put big fans in there that did nothing but move air through the building.
I guess my thing about that is just that, I feel like I sort of want it to be, really at grade and not a separate floor. And the floor level is, very much part of the ground, or, I mean, the black floor, I feel like, so is it only white sculptures allowed in this museum? Was to offset your black floor, or,
Yes.
I think the idea of it sort of rising up, or it being more confused as to whether it's a building or a park. I think the thing that's really interesting about what you're doing is that sort of confusion, and I think I want it to be even more confused by not having a separate floating plane, or by having the steps. I like the steps you were showing, and I guess it brought to mind the Canova Museum, which is one of my all-time favorites, where you're seeing people rising up and sculptures set up a few feet, and that spatially makes a really wonderful juxtaposition. And I appreciate the edges and the idea of extending out into the space. I really like those views that you were showing. But I think ultimately one thing that's really sort of amazing about what you're proposing is that while it is really big, from one view, you're potentially seeing straight through it and seeing only very thin lines. And I think that would be really neat. Yeah, nice drawings.
All right, Stephen.
Yeah.
I need to, guys, any more concluding comments? Michael, you haven't spoken for a while. Any new thoughts? No sound, dude.
No, I just started looking at the detail when he made the sections larger. And I was going to sort of point out how gravity works in some places. And
Not permitted in my studio.
well, like that one right there, for instance, right there. This one is carrying the most weight. And usually you would put the wall underneath it. If you don't want the wall underneath it, then you'd probably need to transfer it laterally and then down. But, you know, that's something that you'll learn in time.
Okay.
And then I was also wondering the use of those big wood timbers. I like are those big wood timbers that you're using?
This big wood timbers. Yes, yeah.
Okay. Is there anything else in there wood? What's the purpose of the wood timbers? I mean, my first thought when I realized those are big wood timbers is that somehow you had this idea about suggesting that trees are moving through the building somehow.
Better. But the entire structure was wooden, so the beams and the timbers.
But those are the only things that are exposed wood?
I know. I'm in a structural design in wood class right now, and I think maybe that's why I did that, because I got really sort of a bad excuse, but
Okay, we have to move on then, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Okay,
Wait, and that was a pretty cool like bombshell that you dropped in there about surrounding Elizabeth Ney completely. That was like, wow, that was a cool idea.
this is Catherine.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, unmute, I guess. Okay, can you guys hear me probably?
Yes.
Yes.
You don't need a mask right now.
Okay.
You're 60 feet.
I'd feel bad if,
It helps with the relationship.
okay. You guys. Okay. Let's share this little presentation.
Maybe it's that.
Okay, here we are. So this is, of course, a sculpture museum designed to become a cultural center and make this park something of a destination for art enthusiasts and people in general. Okay, so I designed a modular structure for this. It is aesthetically referential to the human body. The layered composition of it with the steel ribs and the concrete skin are similar to the bones and skin of human anatomy. And the figurative tone is further articulated by the hourglass shape of the modules. Oh, okay. It also functions as an abstraction and as an aesthetic object. So let's actually start by looking at the structure here. Here's an axon of how these concrete shells are interacting with this steel rib structure. So it's comprised of arches and domes. So we have these tension rings here resisting the outward force at the open ends of the domes. I think that the concrete takes advantage of concrete's fluidity to make custom skins for these. And that allows for these circular cutouts that function as windows and doors into the modules, which you can see here from various angles. Here's a model.
Yeah, you might say where the building is on the site.
Right, let's check that out here. So I did decide to eliminate this street and create a super park, combining the power striped park with the May site, which I think makes both of them more attractive as a destination. I think Craig's point earlier about the way that Hyde Park is somewhat hospitable, but the cars and the traffic in the streets and the fact that it's not a lot of public space really makes it less of a pedestrian area than it might be if there was more of these like larger open spaces. So the museum is situated here on the northeastern side of the site to allow for many of the natural features to remain. I created sort of a bold zigzag shape here, which would be more of a boardwalk through these interesting botanical areas. And that connects you to the old May Museum, which remains in its own context as, you know, an interesting artifact and destination within the site. And then there's an additional connecting sidewalk there. I have the primary freight access located over here and a little bit of above ground parking. Let's check out this floor plan. So you can see here, there's this sort of open outdoor porch where the concrete skin arches over, making a little bit of a covered outdoor place to hang out. And the building does sort of frame a courtyard here. Let's just go ahead and keep going. Here's the second floor upstairs. So the floor plate actually cuts into the curvature of the wall. So you can see this interior line here where the wall meets the floor, but then it swoops outward. So the plan cut is this exterior line, but the wall meets the floor here on this interior ring. You can see there's some double height atriums where people can read by the book stacks and some additional gallery space.
What are the little squares with a circle with an X?
Yeah, that's a symbol for the sculptures just in the museum. Here's a basement plan where you can see the parking garage and the art storage on the lower level. The freight elevator is located here, as you can see, and access to the parking from the street. Here's the building in section. You can see the steel ribs are articulated in the interior of the concrete shell, but they're concealed from the exterior, although they show through where the concrete skin is cut away.
So the concrete's not load bearing?
No, I'm envisioning the primary structure to be the steel ribs. Although it probably provides some lateral resistance, but I'm not really envisioning it being a key structural element. Here's this section. You can see how the art storage is nestled in the parking garage and etc. Here's the view we're getting from inside these conjoined domes. I like how the concrete, the roundness of the concrete and the light playing off of it creates different effects. Here's the upstairs. There's a Nasher Sculpture Center inspired roof, which allows for natural light to come in, but hopefully filters some of it out. And here's another view from the interior. Walrus sculpture. Here's the courtyard view again. I would like to point out that I don't think this is Kentucky bluegrass. I usually try to Photoshop in some local, flora and fauna, just for local relevance. And as you can see here, the glass is sort of like offset, and here you can see how that outside walkway kind of feels where the structure continues, but it becomes unconditioned space. So I think that's really all I have to say. If anyone would like to launch into their views on this.
What attracted you to this system?
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
What attracted you to this system?
Yes. So I wanted there to be a repetition. I think I was interested in Elizabeth Ney as this person who was a feminist, but she was also like, I guess I was going for an aesthetic that was somewhat industrial. Like she was sort of this worker person. I mean, she was like literally pounding out these stone sculptures. And I wanted it to be like strong, but also feminine. So I think it's really like, it doesn't feel dainty. I feel like it feels strong. It also has like a curvature and a little bit of like feminine character to it, not to like ascribe, gender like characteristics or something, but
That's a good answer. Have you worked with systems before?
With what kind of systems? Modules?
Any system, yeah, modules or anything that's a system that can be limiting, but it can also reveal opportunities.
I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when you say that would be the vocabulary of dance, because it's extremely rigid
Mhm.
And that rigidity, I think, provides opportunities. I think also just the nature of the human body has a lot of physical limitations to the way your bones and muscles interact and move together. But those limitations also make things like dance and athletics possible.
Another good answer. Are you a dancer?
Not now. I guess I was when I was younger.
Yeah. No, I think that's what's important about what you just said is specifically is how do you take all of the experiences from childhood, move it forward, and use it in some way. And I think because when I'm looking at this particular image, it made me think about that you actually overcame the limits of a system, where a limit can basically be tyrannical. It can like force you to do things, and it looks like you were not in control of it. You were basically just the one driving the truck, so to speak. But anyways, I think it's a really good exercise to take on a problem that has a very strong inherent limits, which sets up constraints, and then how to manage those constraints in a way where you end up with enough variety that keeps people interested. So I think on the material and the material logic and structural system, it can be both. It can be both steel and concrete system, and still keep the thinness of it. Is this your steel members might be a little bit bigger, and so the application of the steel might come first, and the concrete might come second, but you would be working on it as a composite structural system, as opposed to the concrete isn't doing much work, so it's but it's I think it's a really it's simple in one sense, but then you're exploring how to take that, how to discover a simplicity on the other side of the complexity, which I think is a really wonderful problem to set for yourself.
Cool, I support that. That sounds like a good plan.
I have a comment about the system, which is a positive analysis of this. The word modular is often abused and misused, and most people think it just means a bunch of squares that can be stuck together. And actually, modular just means kind of replaceable and manipulatable within a set of limitations. So one of the most modular things that humans have created is an airplane. And an airplane is anything but square, right? But boy, you can take an airplane apart and redo it and use other parts, and it's modular. It has to be, but it's not at all square. And so in your case, you're looking at modular in the same way an engineer might look at an airplane as modular. It's simply things that have to go together for various purposes. And I think originally I was nervous about the construction system, but seeing it now, I feel like it's grown into a good composite system. But going back to the modular idea, one thing that would be intriguing is how the internal pieces inside the system fit into those modules. It's kind of a next layer of thinking, like what about the toilets, and what about the other components that aren't structure? Because like an airplane is a good example where there's a modular system holding the frame, and then there's a whole other set of modular systems that hold the seats and the air conditioning and electrical systems. So I like the fact that you've been able to treat that word modular with more implicit intellect than simply sticking a bunch of things together next to each other and calling it modular. So that part I quite like. There are some, one criticism I'd like to make is in this, well, there's a couple of things I wish were a little different. Let's go to the site plan, please. The axis of Avenue G. Avenue G is one of the most important streets in Hyde Park. It runs all the way down to whatever that other street is, way the hell down there. And there's some of those big Victorian houses on Avenue G. And so as you come down Avenue G, it ends in a parking lot. And you've gone through all this effort to cross over Avenue G with a park. And then you put the cars there. So as you, I would have preferred that, no, Avenue G is where the cars are.
Oh, right.
That's Avenue G. Yeah, you parked over Avenue G, which, by the way, I'm totally I'm in favor of. I think that's a great thing. But it's a shame that to then at the end of it, the Avenue G axis through Hyde Park with all these amazing homes, the thing you reach at the very end is a parking lot. So, you know, it's a kind of missed opportunity there. And I think when you bridge over the park across the street, you've got a lot of opportunity to make an amazing conclusion to Avenue G, which, by the way, I think G goes right through the center almost, more so than Speedway. It's more than Speedway. It is through the height of Hyde Park. So, you know, that's one criticism I have. The other one is I didn't quite understand this Harry Carey difficult, feng shui, knifey, alligator teeth walkway. Could you explain that?
Yes. So the fundamental purpose of this walkway is not really to recreate a natural trail like this running trail would be. And it's also not per se about practical movement from point A to point B, because there is this practical pedestrian walkway here.
Oh, I see.
The function of this is really to take you on a journey through the botanical landscape of the Ney site.
Yeah.
And so that actually involves turning the normal functions of a sidewalk upside down and putting more length than is necessary to get from one place to another. And a zigzag seems to be a natural shape to convolute one's movement.
And you put sculpture out there too, right?
Yes, exactly.
I had a question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you said you're drawing inspiration from Elizabeth May, that some of the things that you wanted to infuse into your own project were qualities of strength, and I believe you said femininity, like in the form of curviness. So I wanted to ask, where do you currently view the strength of your I guess your building coming from? Is it in the choice of concrete as a material, or is it more formal? Because I almost read the form of your building as very tectonic, very light, despite you using concrete. To me, that's sort of how it feels to me. And so, like, I'm curious, like, where are you getting the strength and the heaviness from in your project?
I'm feeling like there's sort of a symbolic gesture of someone like standing like this, yeah, where they have like their knees bent and their arms up. And so they're like, I don't know, grounded, but like.
Yeah, it's funny because you said concrete and then you started sort of talking about femininity and curviness, and I almost started thinking of, you know, like, I'm blanking on his name, but, you know, famous Mexican architect who did, you know, very thin concrete shells. Why can I not remember his name right now? Yes.
Oh,
Felix
yeah.
Candela. And so, like,
Absolutely.
I almost would want to see concrete being used in that way, and I would sort of see like more femininity and curviness from something like that's more formally like that than modular. I don't know. That's just what I was thinking. I was curious if like what we.
I think the only building that immediately comes to mind is he did some restaurant with a concrete vaulted roof that repeats like a flower.
Anyone else?
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in. I mean, I think it's what I really like about your scheme is the ambition of it. I think you've taken a system that is really difficult to resolve, you know, into a building of this scale. And I appreciate the effort to do so. And it reminds me, I mean, there's kind of two ways to deal with modularity, or maybe I could say aggregation of similar pieces. And one is the way that you've done it here, where you repeat the same unit. And then the variation is through either how it's inhabited. So it's a more loose kind of fit of the repetition and then the program, or it's what you apply to it. And so I think what's really interesting about your project are the apertures, like those glass surfaces. They're not just punches They're not, just more repetition of the curve. There's like a very kind of strange profile that you've created. And I think that's an opportunity to introduce a modulation to the project that keeps the repetition of the structure intact, but adds variation to the space and the way you occupy it. The other way is someone like Toyo Ito, in the Tama library, which is a modularity that differentiates, the actual form differentiates, or even the Tai Chung project where, it's there's an inversion of the positive and negative space. And so I think that's an area where you might start to go further. Like, what is the way I introduce variation to this? One is the projection of aperture. The other might be the use of program. But then the other one might be these other systems that start to plug in, almost like accessories. So you mentioned at the very beginning, you had this like Nasher inspired surface on the top. And man, I would love to see a design for what that is, because that, Nasher is so beautiful. That's also a module at a very small scale that's repeated. And then through that variation produces a really interesting perforation. Like, what is that? It's right now it's a stand-in for something else that I think you might have in mind. But that detail, like adding that craft and that detail and that resolution to this project would really, I think, make more sense of the repetition of the larger unit. But otherwise, I really do like the ambition. I think it produces really interesting spaces, like the negative space of the outside coming into the positive, like right there in the middle of the rendering. Those kind of moments I think are really interesting opportunities that maybe that Nasher inspired top starts to filter in and become part of that surface.
I like that idea.
Why did you put the running track and the basketball court and the swimming pool?
They are pre-existing, but
They're already there?
right now there's a street that runs through here, so I'm just suggesting we obliterate it and allow this to become more.
I was giving you credit for putting things there for people that may not have any interest in sculpture or art. But then once they're there, they say, wow, what's that? And then next thing you know, I would figure out how to integrate it more instead of right now, everything, you got 4 quadrants. I would rip out that running track and the basketball court and the swimming pool and figure out how to not give them their own territory. Yeah. Maybe you run around or through the building, the swimming pool is a whole other deal because you have to have all these other facilities that go with that.
There, Michael.
I just say I just like the even though they were there as a strategy to find reasons for people to come to a place you want them to come to, even if it's not for the reasons that were originally
For sure.
not the main reason is because there really aren't enough. There isn't enough public space. We use all of the terminology, pedestrian friendly and yada yada. It's like old towns, that have, zigzagging sidewalks and I don't know. People just don't. I don't know. That's I think what Craig brought up about the zigzag walkway. I would think unless there was some payoff at the end of each of those zigs, you're not going to zag. You're basically going to walk straight across. And you see this on university campuses all the time. The architectural conceit of putting a path system that's based on the geometry that the architect prefers, and then see the grass dead in the areas where people actually walk.
Side, like the Robert Irwin at the Getty, where you're sort of you're starting to see people sort of stack up on top of each other with a variation of plantings. Would be an interesting.
I think something, if she worked on this more, something like that.
One thing I did want to mention is the Avenue G has been made into what do you call it, a quiet street to allow more pedestrian enjoyment and biking and walking along, and it's really nice in that I mean, just to let the street be without cars has been a nice thing for the neighborhood. And there is actually a lot of discussion about as we the Friends of the May, try to think about what happens on the site and on the north in particular. You know, could we turn it into a larger, because the site of the May is a City of Austin park. It's a museum within a park, within a city park. So it, you know, is a natural next step to think about how does it work with Scheit Park as a whole. So I think this is a really
I think Greg's point is great, though, that Avenue G ends, and that is a gateway. That has to be a public moment, you know, as a destination.
Yeah, I completely agree that parking is a little disappointing at that moment. Or, you know, does it continue in a pedestrian form? But I think the thing that I really appreciate about your project is the way that it essentially seems like it sort of relates to the trees somehow. I mean, it's modular, but I feel like it has, I mean, not just because you're drawing circular trees and circular modules, but the sort of, you know, ball-like nature of the top of them, I think would sort of speak to the trees potentially and create an interesting edge along 45th. I like where it gets straight along that edge. I think that creating sort of a boundary up there is a nice move. And I feel like it does relate well to a range of types of sculpture. Like I like that it is clearly of contemporary vocabulary, architectural vocabulary, or even future architectural vocabulary, but it also would work well with those art or romantic classicist sculpture like maze, and I think that sort of tension is really nice about it. I wonder if I almost want that to be pushed a little further, and maybe you're just completely relentless about each pod has one sculpture in it, and there's like this like very clear modularity that is continuing. I definitely appreciate the development that you've taken since mid-review. It's you know, I think the sort of struggle is paying off. I feel like the upstairs, I want to see more of what you're doing downstairs, upstairs, like more solid roof maybe with views out over. I like the cards coming down to give you a view out, but it sort of feels too open and bright up here. I like this sort of partially open, partially closed nature that this has down here.
Yeah, this has more of a monastic cave-like feeling, and then it gets to be a little bit terracey up there, I guess.
And 140 degrees.
It starts to look like Second Life or something upstairs, that computer game.
John, you've been quiet.
Yeah, I must say, Catherine, I'm still puzzling over the building. I have not allowed myself to venture onto the site and discuss how the park would be shaped. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes and decide whether the prime emotion here is what I see as an hourglass almost. You think of it as body, but I see a bunch of hourglasses colliding. Or was the basic emotion here the contrast between a cave, a sort of domed cave with these irregular cuts, versus a sort of flowering volume at the top? What was the basic motivation?
So
Emotionally, at an emotional level, you know, gut feeling.
yes,
Day one, the first time you turned over the sketch.
it was
Which has not
probably,
changed very much.
no, it truly hasn't changed very much. would be the surreal quality of seeing a large number of slightly varied, but ultimately kind of the same looking human heads, like on a table in her studio. I think that's what really just.
That was all those busts.
Yeah, because they all look so much alike, but it's like the variedness of like their little nose or their bushy eyebrows give you like the character of a person, but it's like a conglomerate, like this troupe that's working together. So I'm hoping that like this variation on those.
I must say my own exploration with this might have been, I'm a little, again, it's a matter of taste, and your taste is probably better than mine, but the interstitial leftover spaces feel odd to me. The spaces that are left between the half dome that goes upwards and the half dome that goes downwards. And I might have either explored taking those figures apart a little bit so that the interstitial space can be occupied all the way up. Sort of, if instead of colliding them, you had spaced them apart, you would have created, so to speak, a larger building where these would be figures in it. You see what I'm saying? If on plan they were spaced apart.
Yes.
Other opportunities might have been created, including a different way of handling the upstairs and allowing to look down a little bit more interestingly, perhaps. I don't know. I'm still struggling to imagine how. I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and I'm not quite succeeding. I heard other people say how brave you are going with a modular system, but to me, that's not the most interesting thing here. The most interesting thing here is the two worlds, the below and the above. And I'm not quite certain that you've connected them from the point of view of visitor experience. And when I look at your rendering at the top, the terrace, for me, this kind of is almost a disappointment because I don't actually see myself pushed upwards towards sky. I see myself on an ordinary deck. I have no idea why it's wood, and then there is this sort of sculptural boundary around me. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure that you've created a rich enough dialogue between the above and the below condition, which to me was the primary thing here. But I heard you. The primary thing for you is the faces that sort of look at each other at ground level, and so fine. Yeah, we have different. My attempt to get to terms with this is slightly different than yours, I guess.
I can see how there's a substantial contrast in the experience above and below.
Below you have power because it is like a forest of domes, of caves, but above it sort of disappears to my eye.
Right.
This looks like a big.
It might be the view and the rendering too. You're sort of far away and you've removed some of the concrete panels inside. But I think John's point is a good one.
You see, if I was to think of the terrace as of the upstairs as deck, which is what your render gives the impression, this wood deck, that's when I might have wanted to reshuffle a little bit the relation of those units. Anyway, yeah.
Good.
Good stuff.
Stay calm.
I want to make a small comment. I know you have a background prior to architecture in something else,
Yes.
and that is.
Art primarily.
And what was the art? What type of art? Painting?
I was making animated ballet videos and drawings and things.
Drawings, yeah. So for me, this is, it's the image of the interior. That one or the other one. It's really compelling because I begin to see the way in which these forms impact the space. So I think it has a lot to do with light and shape and a sense of materiality. For me, what's tricky is that it's sort of an initial gesture that still has yet to be studied to the level of the significance of the initial gesture. Again, the initial gesture is very compelling, but I feel like we need to go so much more. And I bring up the background in making, more specifically, like making, if you're painting or drawing, there's certain things that those tools will do. Like my husband's a painter, there's certain things that he can do in oil and other things that he can do in acrylic. And when he draws, he can do certain things, but they don't all happen at once in the same medium. And I feel like there's a certain resistance that begins to happen when you're a maker. And I feel like when I look at this image, it's like an initial gesture. There's something compelling about it. It's like a collage, and I want to take it and I want to push it so much farther. And the ways in which I push it farther are, is this module always the same size? Is it always the same height? That's a programmatic question. Like, how does it perform in relationship to programming? What happens when I have a dome and I take out the center? Well, now we have steel, right? But it's still, I don't know how this construction goes together. And when it's in this collage, it's really thin, right? And so I put in a couple of things, the Tama library, and then this other woven piece, because I feel like those things have a certain material resistance that would be gratifying to you. And so I would say, as you're moving forward, you know, you're in advanced studios, you're moving forward and you're putting on an architect's hat, then what is that? What is the resistance that you have to work with? And how does that resistance help you push this into the level that moves toward building, into the level that I think is as strong as that initial gesture? And so for me, I think it could go, it's a strong initial gesture, but when we have to deal with the roof, or when we put in the floor and where the floor exists, it seems to compromise that initial shape. And that initial shape is doing so much in terms of light and sort of ambience. And I feel like the second level loses that. And I don't know.
Catherine, you've heard a lot of this from me before.
Yeah, the quality of light in the upper level was definitely a topic of discussion. One thing that could have been done was, I don't think this is necessarily a good idea, but if there was a fully opaque dome on the top, it would definitely have a more similar quality of light.
Did you try it? Just to see?
No, I did not.
Well, I mean, that's the, like, I
So
think.
Catherine, there's the heart of the problem. You've gotten this kind of advice almost since the second week you invented this. And everyone in the room is excited as hell, except maybe you, I don't know. But you do it like super casual, like taking advice. Super casual. It's like, oh, I might do that, I might not. It might be there next week, it might not be. And it's really hard to read how seriously you think this is an architectural gesture, or whether you care. Hold on.
Why? Because
you actually entered none of these problems.
Well, wasn't privy to the experience, but I feel like as a maker, you're used to getting your hands dirty. And sometimes there are successes and sometimes there aren't, but the study, like big, small, and perhaps there is, yields something in the end. And I would encourage you to bring that maker background into. I saw
I
that.
have it over there on that table too.
So I think your initial impulse is really compelling, and I really appreciate that you're talking about the person, not just the objects. And I think we can talk about sexuality in space. I think we can talk about all those things. And again, all of that I'm really excited about. But if I think about the level of study in some of the projects, I feel like it remains a little bit more at the gesture. And so I just would encourage you to figure out what it is that gives you that resistance or that material quality that allows you to push it forward a little bit farther.
You know what, I actually do remember now that the original model had a solid roof, but I deleted it pretty early on in this process. And then it got put back on as like a mesh. So there was at one point, it did exist. I don't think I ever rendered it, so. But just.
But it's possible that the model for you, like, it might, like these forms, you can do like a shell of plaster over a balloon and remove the balloon, right? There's something like you can, and so I like physical making, you know, and it's always been part of how I think. People make models a lot, but I feel like you also are going to share some of that feeling. And so these digital skills, like this image, I think is so powerful. And I would want to complement it with other tests potentially. And it's just a thought. I mean, I'm so excited by this image. But when I look at the section and I see that space in between, and I don't understand really it as a building yet. And I don't need to know everything about the building, but when I look at that, it's like, it's not quite as good as that other image. And so why not? What is it that I would need to do to take the measured or the quantitative to be as powerful as the qualitative? And so
I'm sorry.
This has to be last comment.
I was going to make a counterpoint to John's comment earlier, whereas I agree there could be more understanding of above and below and the space in between. I want to say personally that the uselessness of those ridiculously strange diamond shapes are some of the power of the project. Looking through them, they frame things beyond, you can't get in them. I always say that there are two great lost opportunities in most architecture, and I call them the two X's, the lost opportunity of excess and the lost opportunity of exterior. And this has both of those in these strange shapes in between. They're excessive and they're exterior. And so in some ways that I like it, but it was just a small comment. I don't want to spend any more time.
I think if I was, I feel like before going into this review, my main concern with the project was that if I could like really address anything more thoroughly, I was thinking it would be cool to find a way for the building to just be like more hospitable to plant life on the exterior or something, or like make it more of a haven for just like, I don't know, like does the concrete have to just like make a blank space?
I mean, it is interesting. You can think of with bubbles and how bubbles pack, right? They're different sizes, but the surfaces touch and they do have little gaps. I mean, that's an interesting thing to look at, to think, because this is very grid-like. Like I could imagine these bubbles taking on different sizes, but they could still pack.
Like they squish.
Yeah, they still touch, but they're different sizes. So there could be something there that would be interesting to you.
Well, I guess one thing is to decide if they're bubbles or not, or are they whirling dervishes?
Right. Yes, we've definitely talked about.
Well, I'm going to say, Catherine, thank you very much. What a great project.
Thank you all.
Maybe another 3 or 4 minutes of general discussion. Nice. Oh, we're done. We're done.
Oh, okay. Wow. Wow, what an interesting day. Even with the technology strangeness, I have to say. I wish I was there. I really do. It's so hard for me to do this in this kind of format. Nice to hear everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's good. Your face is 10 feet high.
Yeah. I guess I could say that the project is so important. She's an interesting person. It's an interesting place, and sculpture is an important art. I think the project has tremendous value, and I know that several people have said this during their comments, and I totally agreed. I know also this morning we didn't talk enough about sculpture. We didn't talk enough about Elizabeth Ney, and I guess partly because Michael, you as a teacher said, well, we don't need to think too much about the building. We didn't talk a lot about the building in a way, but that's okay. I'm fine with that. But you know, it's important, obviously, that I know that those issues came up, I'm sure, during the buildup to the conclusion. But I think it has a tremendous value, and it exposes our weaknesses, this project. It exposes so many of our weaknesses as architects, that we don't understand always art in a very real way. We think we do, but we don't. It's such a sensitive thing to design a museum. It's one of the hardest things to do on many, many levels. Museums are the slowest moving of structures. I mean, you're in them for hours and you notice every little problem, as opposed to, you know, a shop that you're in and out of very quickly, or a theater where you're only in the lobby for 20 minutes and you know, you're back in a dark room. So a museum exposes all of that. Plus the site is so sensitive. It's such a sensitive site. It exposes in a way our weakness as architects in understanding the value of site beneath what it looks like or its geometric considerations. And then finally, it exposes the challenge of what it means to be big in a fairly small place. And those are all things that are just like hell to try and solve. So, you know, I definitely applaud the challenge and how many of you took it on. I would say ultimately, though, you know, so when you get a big challenge, it means you have to work in such a different way than you might ordinarily work. This isn't just like solving a math problem with a plus sign. It's complex physics here. We're talking about theoretical physics at some level. You really have to engage in almost like pouring yourself in. It's not a pastime, this project.
Thank you, Greg. Very, very truly said. John, I'm sure you'd like to sign off.
I have a comment to make. First of all, thank you, Michael, for inviting me, and it has been a great pleasure to look at the work. In my mind, sort of museums help us look at whatever the content is, art or otherwise, in two different ways: through creating atmosphere, almost like a containing atmosphere within which then a curator could stage an exhibition. And then also by framing views. And I must say, as an admirer of Michael's Architecture Beyond Experience, I came expecting that there would be a deliberate use of architecture to create, so to speak, forms of address. One visitor to another, one statue to another, one statue to a visitor, and maybe networks of those. And in the end, what truly impressed me is the inventiveness in creating powerful architecture that also creates distinctive atmosphere. The step where maybe you stage a particular choreography of movement or a particular choreography of intersecting gauges, that stage has not really been reached, at least in the drawings. Maybe it was reached in the minds of the designers, but maybe it wasn't quite yet depicted in the drawings. So these are my main thoughts. But I, as someone that taught a museum studio this semester myself, I found the power of the atmospheres creator rather impressive.
Thank you, John. Who's out there? Michael left, right? Yeah. Okay. Guys.
Yeah, because you should include your representative.
Exactly. You're the museum.
I think you've had a really challenging project. I'll just say that, because you know, knowing the site, and it's highly specific in its surroundings, with the creek, with the building itself, with the landscape, with the significant trees. You know, you've had a very large project, so it's not an easy project. But it was nice to see the different, I didn't get to see everybody, but it was nice to see the different takes on the project. And Yeah, I mean, I could imagine, given its scope, you could keep going with it. There are a lot of moments that I think there are a lot of intimate moments that are harder to read when you're trying to figure out something so large. And so I appreciated those smaller details, whether it's the landscape or the light or the sense of moving people, pictures, sculptures, shadows. And I think those things were really gratifying and began to lend a level of specificity that I associate with the site, but in a different way. So
Thank you. Thank you for being. Which one are we gonna do? That's only one.
Let's see, yeah, I just want to say how inspiring it is to see all this great work and the sort of stretching the boundaries of what could be there and sort of thinking in a very utopian grand gesture about the May and what it could become. And I really appreciate Michael's interest in the museum. I really feel like that it's, you know, one of Austin's real hidden gems, and I'm glad it's getting more attention and very grand visions for what it could be. I think just first for context, currently we're real involved with trying to figure out if there could be a bathroom added to the museum, which is actually an incredibly thorny problem because of the historic nature of the site and ADA access and the flora of city utilities that cross there and archaeology and, you know, 6 layers of different parties involved and then in what happens
in a bathroom.
And there is no bathroom accessible to the public at all.
I know, found out where it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an ordeal to find it.
The exterior?
Yeah,
Exterior?
yeah, we believe it have to be exterior for it to be historic.
It might be easier.
To be attached to a historic.
Elizabeth, it might be easier to build one of these than to get that. Because of a museum like this, well, it gets major, it's like the decisions happen at which.
Maybe that's the.
So you're going back to.
There's some bathrooms across the street at the swimming pool.
Yeah, that's true. And I think one of the things I really appreciate that all the buildings have such distinct personalities and character and pieces that I would say definitely. And I think that speaks really well to your development as designers and Michael's work helping pull you forward into that sort of strong vision. And I think one thing for me that I kept sort of hitting up against is, and this is probably being too specific, but my background before architecture was art history. And so I really care a whole lot about museums and I spend a whole lot of time in museums and thinking a lot about exhibits relative to the buildings they're in. And I think I was just really struggling to not have a clearer picture of what the specific sculptures were and that a building would be designed around a specific type of sculpture. And so in some ways I feel like it was hard.
It was a huge flaw in this program. Is that there was no equivalent of a collection. I remember fantasizing when we set this up. Oh, the students are all going to start by making a collection, which thanks to Google, it's not going to be a problem. We're going to have about 150 works of art, and we're just going to put them in the museum. Well, you can get pictures of things, but you can't get the thing. And you can't get digital models. And to sort of construct digital models of that would take an entire sort of be factory work to make every one of those things.
Sure. Yeah.
It was actually just insurmountable. And so we talked about just doing a collage, but what they mainly did was just pull whatever and stick them in there. And that prevented any kind of real dialogue between how do I want to see this piece? How do I want to see that piece? Which is what Scarpa could do. Scarpa had a collection. He interviewed every piece in there and placed it. And so did Van Eyck. They really need the art.
Yeah.
And we don't have that small. Setting up the program of relation. And I think what happened was the landscape problem, or the land problem, just took over the whole problem. So we did atmospherics, I think, quite well. Like, I think they're very memorable places. The students can make everyone. I'm not going to forget what it would feel like to be there. But we never did get to the relation.
And the landscape is really strange. I mentioned it once to you, and that is that it slumps. It's actually a kind of ugly slump. It goes diagonally across the side towards Avenue G and 40, whatever that is, so 42nd, or no, what is it, 45th or whatever. It kind of goes diagonally. And so when you stand at the house, it kind of drops away in a weird, not very dramatic way, but for me, I was hypersensitive to that. And you know, it just suggests how complicated that landscape really is.
It's kind of, when Khan put the Kimball in, it was a big piece of land that just sloped down to, it looked like a tsunami coming towards you.
Yeah.
The Council's museum over there. And so he literally built a dam and just like pushed it back. Those big faults are kind of a challenge to the land.
Cool. Yeah, I didn't know that.
So I don't know if, you've heard me say a few times, will I do this again in the spring? It actually might be too difficult.
You can simplify it, Michael, and make it more approachable. I think definitely the program is achievable.
That would be great, because that's what they really
We
need.
could do a bathroom. Right.
No, I'm serious. I mean, I said it too, that, you know, the program itself would probably be reevaluated at some level and make it more in reasonable relationship to the NAE itself. It's quite ambitious, that particular.
Yeah, I was going to put the Kimball on the site, basically. That was the idea.
No, and I put the Metropolitan Museum there.
Apologize to you guys.
No, I
Maybe
think
we try to
it's
do
good.
that.
I actually think it's good to have that connection.
I mean,
You're forced to make a decision.
It was really fun.
but then it has to be a part of the dialogue. Because we have these problems all the time with projects we're working on, and what we do is, as I mentioned to you, Michael, is we find a way around the problem rather than just saying, "Oh, we're stuck with this." Like I mentioned, you could put some of the sculpture outside. That helps drop the scale down.
Again, I'll make more outdoors, small print.
You also have that resource now. You could technically curate like 15 or 30 of those digital models and say every student has to put these 30 models.
As you guys make a library.
Yes, I found a few.
Like, I just posted that website, you can search by artist.
Yeah.
But then like so many, they wouldn't have any, or they'd have just one. But, you know.
And most any museum worth their weight in gold would talk about, do we really need that much storage that I need to pay for when I can't even afford a toilet? So, you know, there's probably some of that in there too that's a little ambitious.
Greg, we owe you a lot. You've been with us twice now.
Oh, thanks.
In my heart all the time, so thank you, Greg.
Yeah, my pleasure. Wonderful to be here.
Well, thank you. I learned a lot from interacting with your studio, museum studio. So thanks. And you guys, thank you so much, especially you.
Okay, hope to see you soon. Bye-bye. Good luck, everyone.
Okay, bye.
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 Thanks.
All right, so thanks for viewers. I'm just going to chat to the students. Feel free to.
Oh, well, slowly. No.
Guys, how many of you are
Have an example.
Oh,
yeah, an example?
I have
I'm thinking we're gonna clean up the studio somewhere. I need to get my books back out of the studio. I need to get your documentation.
Wait, can I ask you a question? Is this,
Those files.
can I ask you a question? Is this still live streamed? Because you're larger than life.
Something.
We can just end.
Are we playing a beach Friday?
No.
Thank you guys.
Is everyone uploaded on the box already? Okay. That's a lot. So I'm going to present this first. You guys did really such great work. It was a very difficult project. This is hard to do. You're probably not going to get those presentations out there.
You didn't want to challenge yourselves. I just
Yeah, I thought it was a cool
Well,
project.
thanks, guys. If you do those evaluations, just put vibes in them. I'll get a and I'm feeding you.
Oh, she's okay. Oh, she's not going to get a tough time. I actually rock up her ears. Thank you. I wish I was in there. Oh, Max already came here. He finished his super model. Was like, maybe he's doing it. Do you help like putting this stuff back?
I beg your pardon?
Do you know like putting this stuff, like the tables back and stuff?
No,
Okay.
this is a better arrangement than there was.
That's true.
But I can't, what the hell's going on here now?
Oh, you're still.
We're still live. And this thing, can you see where this might go?
And, oh, here.
The mouse control. I think.